one.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news and events across our divided states, as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, first up, in the news this morning, U.S. COVID cases have officially passed 19 million. Yesterday in the U.S., 1,345 more people died from the virus, bringing the total U.S. deaths to 332,246. This comes as the House of Representatives on Monday, that's last night, passed a measure to increase stimulus checks for Americans under a certain income level to $2,000 after President Donald Trump championed the effort, sending the bill to the Senate where its future is less certain. Jamarl, I'm sure you saw this. What do you think about this one?
Thanks, Trump. Thank you, Trump. Because, look, at this point, it's very clear. Joe Biden contacts Nancy Pelosi and Republicans, apparently. And after that conversation, they believe half of what Nancy Pelosi said was unacceptable was all of a sudden acceptable, and not just acceptable, perfectly fine. All of the Democrats on CNN and MSNBC get on script. Get on script. You don't believe me? Go back and watch. Going so far to say, yeah, the president saying $2,000 is an attack on America. Fact of the matter is they were shamed to this position. This should have been their basic position. And it makes it very clear how a popular program is difficult to turn down. Meaning, we're in a pandemic. There's some of us that have done monstrously well, and there's some of us that have done monstrously poor. And it is very difficult in a pandemic for your congressman to look you in the face and to explain why they believe that you weren't deserving of it as an American. In the same way that the oligarchs were deserving of the trillions that was lavished on them for the last, 20, 30 years. So yeah, it's a tough vote for them to turn down, which is the entire point of making that vote. And it gets across that, look, Democrats could push for things. It is hard to say no to Medicare for all in the middle of a pandemic when you have like 20 million people infected with the illness and medical bills that are going to come from that. Not to mention the comorbidities and the extra things. Like when you look at the research, months after COVID, people still have symptoms. Those are bills. Those people have to pay for those bills. They can fight for those things. They just don't. This is a perfect example of that. That's what I think. That the moment that you make them put their name on something and say, hey, are you for this or not? And are you going to go back and explain to your constituents why you turned this down? They have to explain that. That becomes a different vote. So yeah, now it's going to the Senate, and the question becomes, what's going to happen there? It's probably
what will the Republicans do with it? Absolutely. I mean, another, just coming back to this briefly, we're talking about folks who got COVID, have serious symptoms, and how they would have to fight for it. It is admittedly hard to fight for something when you have chronic fatigue, when you have the long-lasting after effects of a serious illness. So hopefully other people can do the fighting for them on this one. Anyway, back into the news here. Spain's health minister said his country plans to collect and share with other European Union nations information about residents who decide not to get vaccinated for COVID-19. The country's health minister said on Monday. He stressed that vaccination would not be compulsory, but that a register would be set up that would include all the people who turned down the vaccine after being called up for vaccination by Spain's public health service. In an interview with a Spanish television channel, he said that, quote, "This is not a public document and it will be done with the highest respect of data privacy." End quote. His comments come a day after Spain launched its vaccination program with the goal of vaccinating 2.5 million people between January and March, all of them within priority health groups, starting out with residents of nursing homes and the healthcare professionals who care for them. But how about that, Jamarl? A registry for those who decline to take the vaccine. That seems, I'm guessing you're about as against this as I am, even though they're saying they won't make it public. It
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's public. Because what's going to end up happening is people are going to get access to it. Otherwise, why are you making it? Why is it there? If nobody is going to
be shared with other
countries.
It's going to be shared with other governments. That's the idea in the EU.
I guess my thought is it's still going to show at some point. I'm bothered by that. I mean, it's one thing if you have a registry of people who got the vaccination. Okay, fair enough. It just feels different. It feels more inclusive in an odd way for you to say, okay, who turned it down or who didn't get it. It feels very weird. So that's bizarre to me.
It's kind of bizarre to me too. Yeah. All right. Next headline here. South Africa's president Cyril Ramaphosa has announced new, tougher coronavirus restrictions a day after the country recorded more than 1 million COVID-19 cases. Indoor and outdoor gatherings will be banned, a curfew introduced from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., and alcohol sales will be prohibited. Mr. Ramaphosa said the country was at an extremely dangerous point in the pandemic and action had to be taken. Recently, authorities confirmed that a new, faster-spreading variant of the virus had been detected in South Africa. Did we talk about this with Neil Watson? Because I saw her talking about South Africa a couple of weeks ago. I think she was one of the folks who were early on this one.
I don't think this one came up.
That's too bad. Yeah, we would have been ahead of the curve. Not that this is a good thing. New, faster spreading variants of a deadly virus are not what you want to see popping up in the middle, in the full swing. It's sort of in the current peak of the pandemic's death rate globally. Maybe not quite.
Let me ask you this, because this is one of those things that I'm always curious about in the way that people seem to consider two situations to be completely different, even though those situations are the same. So some of the countries have basically said, hey, we shouldn't have this unfairness in distribution of the vaccine to richer countries as opposed to poorer countries. But that's reality. That is how healthcare is distributed now. What's the difference? Like, am I missing something? What's the difference?
I don't. There isn't much of one. But I mean, here's the thing: if you had the vaccine primarily distributed to poorer countries, wouldn't you have a lot of folks crowing that this was another like Bill Gates testing his vaccines on poor people, his deadly vaccines on poor people? Wouldn't that come up very quickly? Oh, you're using the developing world as your litmus test for this or whatever. Your guinea pigs to do this.
See, this goes to the whole thing of why I always make the point, and I know this is offbeat, but alien civilization that was entirely benevolent could never do anything for this world. That reason, like, let's say that the people who were doing that were entirely benevolent. It wouldn't have mattered, meaning the vaccines. Like, it wouldn't have mattered. That would come up. Hey, you're trying to test those vaccines on us because we've done them in the past. So it's not like it's a charge that is like so out of left field.
We would take our fears out on them, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
We would come to it with a bad faith approach. Yeah, just because that's what we're used to. I hear you on that one.
It gets very weird in regards to trying to do the vaccine thing. And you're right, the Bill Gates stuff will come up. Why was Bill Gates putting so much money in it? How much money these guys are going to get from the vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. All of that stuff will come to play. And all of it, honestly, to some degree, will be born out of experience. So
I hear you. It was a cookbook. Did you ever see that one?
Yeah. Twilight Zone.
Yes, yeah.
I should.
All right.
Man, I've had to binge watch a lot of stuff with my wife so she could see it, so she knows some of these references. But yeah, that was one of them. It's a cookbook to serve man. Don't tell anybody what that is, because I want everybody to be able to get the full experience of that Twilight Zone episode.
Exactly. All right, back to the headlines here. The House of Representatives on Monday passed a measure to increase stimulus checks for Americans under a certain income level to $2,000 after President Donald Trump championed the effort, sending the bill to the Senate where its future is less certain. The legislation, which passed with a 275 to 134 vote, we already talked about this, comes a day after Trump signed a coronavirus relief bill into law Sunday evening. By the way, one quick addition to this, Senator Bernie Sanders has threatened to delay a crucial vote to override Trump's veto on a defense funding bill until the Senate holds a vote on $2,000 checks. So that's an important addition to that. I would say that Sanders is taking that role in the Senate. Anywho, U.S. District Judge Allison Nathan, in a brief order yesterday, has denied Ghislaine Maxwell's second attempt at pretrial release. That is Epstein, a parent, child rapist, Madam Ghislaine Maxwell, concluding that none of the new information altered the court's previous determination that Maxwell, an alleged co-conspirator of deceased sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, posed a flight risk if granted bail. Maxwell's legal team spent months preparing what they billed as a comprehensive bail package containing substantial information that was not available to present to the court at Maxwell's initial detention hearing in July. Several friends and family of hers, whose names were redacted from the public court filings, had pledged assets and offered to co-sign the bond. The renewed bail application also confirmed for the first time that Maxwell, 59, has been married since 2016 to Scott Borgerson, who is the founder of a maritime investments company called Cargo Metrics and a former fellow in residence at the Council on Foreign Relations at the old CFR. Just to throw that in there, this had been a rumor that was going around for a little while. It was confirmed. Anywho. In international news, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has accused Colombia of masterminding an attack against the Venezuelan military with support from the country's president, Ivan Duque. Colombia is preparing new attacks, quoting here, Colombia is preparing new attacks against the country's military with trained mercenaries with funding from Ivan Duque, preparing attacks at the end of this year, end quote. That was from Maduro. He said that in a speech that he shared with followers on Twitter. Famous Senegalese-American singer Akon wants to build a futuristic city in Senegal. The new $6 billion project called Akon City will be situated in the middle of a municipality in Senegal. And Akon plans it to be a refuge for all members of the African diaspora. He calls the future region a real-life Wakanda and plans to create a technology center and Senewood in it to develop the film industry. There will be a resort, condominiums, and a stadium. It's also planned that the city will operate on renewable energy sources and will mainly use Acoin, its own cryptocurrency. I don't know why that cracks me up so hard. Oh, God. We'll mainly use Acoin. I almost can't go on. After undergoing 2 years of design and development, Akon announced that construction will begin in 2021. Now, I like this. This is cool. My one note here is, what kind of this is like one variant of cyberpunk, where you have a famous singer who starts a city, and I'm pretty sure that city will be, in large part company owned, and it's like billed as sort of like a part of humanitarian measure, but it's owned by a company, started by a celebrity. And I think it's cool, but am I making any sense here, Jamarl?
No, you are making sense. Like, it's the Jack Fresco thing. Fresco, somebody asked him, would he sell his cities? Because his entire package, like this entire idea of a city that basically runs on its own, is, technological. Well, he's like, no, that defeats the point of me making a city like this. Like, if you have to charge for it, it undermines the beauty of the city in a weird way. I think that's where you're getting at. Like, it's a great idea. If you have hyperloops, you have all this technology and everything else. But who's going to live there? Who can afford to live there? Who's going to be the underclass that builds it? I mean, I'm looking at Saudi Arabia or Dubai, for example, where you have this permanent underclass that builds this huge and beautiful city.
Of migrant labor, effectively slave labor, as they come in.
I mean, it's very weird to see. I mean, when we were there, it's like you just have these people who are just kind of in the background. And then everybody else, you have just fantastic amounts of ridiculous wealth. It's very strange. So yeah, that's my fear of that. And I think that's where you're getting at. At least that's what I think you're hitting.
I can see that too. Yeah, especially because if you think about it, a lot of the African diaspora that I'm sure would show up would be poorer folks who are like fleeing persecution or instability in their countries, a decent chunk of them at least. That is the creation of an underclass. And so unless you create programs to help those people elevate themselves and to help elevate them, frankly, then yeah, I could see that going poorly. Anyway, more news here. On Monday, a Saudi court sentenced prominent human rights activist Loujain al-Hathloul to 5 years and 8 months in prison on terrorism-related charges and banned her from leaving the country for 5 years, sparking a torrent of international criticism. Al-Hathloul, 31, was arrested in May 2018 with about a dozen other women's rights activists just weeks before the historic lifting of a decades-long ban on women drivers, a reform they had long campaigned for. Alexei Navalny has been warned that if he does not immediately return home to Russia from Germany and report to a Moscow office as early as Tuesday morning, he will face serious jail time. Russia's Federal Prison Service accused Mr. Navalny on Monday of violating the terms of a suspended prison sentence. He is still serving out from a 2014 conviction. The service also claims he is evading supervision of Russia's Criminal Inspection Authority. And last quick, I want to make sure we get to this one. Good comment on that last story. But last headline here in tech news, Korea's superconducting tokamak advanced research device, that's a nuclear fusion device, recently set a world record by maintaining its plasma at a super hot 180 million degrees Fahrenheit for 20 seconds. That's over 100 million degrees Celsius. That is a world record. Getting into a slightly more detail in just a second here. This comes after K-Star reached the plasma ion temperature of 100 million degrees for the first time in 2018 for only 1.5 seconds. So this is, again, 10 times longer than that earlier batch. So far, there have been other fusion devices that have briefly managed plasma at temperatures of 100 million degrees or higher. None of them have broken the barrier of maintaining the operation for 10 seconds or longer. The final goal of the K-Star is to succeed in a continuous operation of 300 seconds, that is 5 minutes, with an ion temperature higher than 100 million degrees by 2025. So they're sort of pushing the limits. They've more than doubly broken the previous record at that temperature, which is cool and good for the development of fusion energy, which I'm all in favor of. If we can get that going, get that economically feasible. Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are breaking. We're going into a break in just a minute. On the other side of this break, we'll be back with the Fault Lines Soapbox segment and Jamarl's monologue. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM, 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. Also, make sure you're subscribed. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. $2,000 passes the House. $2,000 stimulus passes the House. Now, keep in mind beforehand, there was a fight between 1.8 trillion to 2.2 trillion. That went away after Joe Biden was elected. Joe Biden gives Nancy Pelosi and Republicans a call And they go back to 900 billion, half of what Nancy Pelosi argued a few weeks earlier as being entirely, completely unacceptable, and lost it talking to Wolf Blitzer, defending herself, making the point that Wolf Blitzer didn't understand, and Wolf Blitzer was being insulting to the committee members that cared for the American public, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 2 weeks later, 900 billion is perfectly okay. And direct stimulus to the American public, unnecessary. Sanders fights in the Senate, hose up, meaning hose up the world, and finally they passed $600. Now, on top of the $600, all of them shake hands and act like this is great. Everybody get on message, go on MSNBC, CNN, all of these guys are on message. Again, a few weeks earlier, 1.8 trillion was unacceptably low. And now everybody's on message. It's amazing how that works and how media corresponds to political will and political intention. Trump comes out. Now, whether you want to say Trump was angry because they didn't accept the 1.8 trillion, whether you want to say he was just belligerent, whether you want to say he was fighting for the American public, all of those things don't really matter. At the end of the day, if Trump was angry that Nancy Pelosi negotiated in bad faith for months while the American public basically burned away, then yeah, I think he has a reason to be mad at that. And I think the American public has complete and just reason to be angry at that. And trying to say it's all Trump's fault at the end of it is nonsense. Also, if you want to say that Trump was fighting for America, fair enough. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump comes out and makes it very clear to the American public that they are not investing in you. They're not giving you stimulus. Yes, they gave these plutocrats trillions for decades, but no, you as the American public are somehow, for whatever particular reason, uniquely undeserving of assistance, undeserving of a bailout, despite we were told that it was perfectly okay for Wall Street to have to bail out. We were told these things. Donald Trump comes out and makes it very clear how little they care about you, and shows it in very clear detail by saying this is how much they're giving to all of these other things, billions. And yet for you, 600 is too much. Trump did that. Whatever you want to think about it, Trump did that. And because he did it, he ends up shaming the Democratic Party, who's supposed to be fighting for this stuff just as a basis of operation, a basis of ideology. It took him to shame them into fighting for this. Now, what happens? The moment that you put up a vote, it's a $2,000 a month, you're stuck with a problem. If you're a Republican and you know you're going to have to go back to your districts and explain to those people why in the middle of a pandemic you didn't believe they were deserving of $2,000. Now, whether you believe that the Republicans are going to be for or against that, I tell you this, Republicans in the population are human beings, and if Donald Trump is saying this is okay, he's giving them social permission to be perfectly okay with getting that $2,000. Each and every congressman would have to go back and look those constituents in the face and explain to them why they were uniquely undeserving of $2,000. Uniquely undeserving in a pandemic of assistance from the government that they've toiled and put all of this money and resources into from the standpoint of tax revenue and from the standpoint of their mental and physical energies. Yeah, those congressmen don't want to do that. Why would they want to do that? Do you want to have that conversation? Do you want to look a parent in the face? Do you want to look a constituent in the face and explain to them how, I'm sorry you're hungry. I'm sorry you weren't able to pay your rent. I'm sorry you have all of these bills based on a pandemic that the government allowed to proliferate in the way that it proliferated just through gross inaction. You are going to have to make that explanation. And the Republicans and Democrats mostly said, yeah, pass. $2,000. I'll let that go. I'll let the Senate take care of that, because none of them want to have to make that very specific argument. Now, doesn't this almost in and of itself create the logic for force to vote? Doesn't it back up the premise that I gave? My point was whether force to vote can force and win or not is almost secondary to the point of using the leverage, and two, putting them on the ledger. Understand your environment. You have nearly 20 million people that have been infected with the virus. Those people that have been infected with the virus don't just get better and go about their lives. Medical research is showing that those people have issues that extend beyond the virus, especially people who had some other kind of illness. Meaning, those people didn't just get COVID and just walk it off like it was the flu. It lasted. What do you think? is happening to the medical bills. You think those medical bills are going up in smoke? They're not. Meaning 20 million people all of a sudden are doused with bills that they might not have been able to pay in and of itself under normal circumstances. Also, I kind of want to make the point that the people who are wealthier could go to their enclaves. They could work their jobs remotely. That's not a bad thing. We're working remotely. It's a luxury that we were afforded, but not everybody was afforded that luxury, and people who weren't afforded that luxury were far more likely to be on the front lines. The reason that you're seeing a lot of African Americans and Hispanics die from this is an economic reason. You're living in jobs, or you're working in jobs that you have to show up at, that you force you to be on the front lines, where you get this question of, do I stay here to take care of my kid, or do I go to work to take care of my kid? Which one? Yes, if I get sick, I could potentially die, or I could, come down with some kind of major illness. But by the same token, if I don't go and work, how am I going to pay for my kid's food? How am I going to pay for the rent? How am I going to do these things? And I'm saying this as a kid who had a mom that was stuck with a similar decision. My kid is sick. How am I going to go to work and yet be there for my kid? Even so much where they threatened my mom to fire her if she didn't show up to work more, despite the fact that her kid was laying in the hospital with a severe degenerative illness. Oh, chronic illness. I guess I'm making the point that it is a difficult thing for you to make that argument to people that they are less deserving, especially in the middle of an emergency. And the same thing goes for force the vote, for Medicare for all. Yes, you may lose, but if you honestly believe that Medicare for all is that popular, and if you honestly believe that within the context of a pandemic with all of these people sick and everything else, that the American public will be more on board for it now than ever, that you're supposed to knock it out of the rafters, then why wouldn't you force the vote? Why wouldn't you put those people's name on it? Why wouldn't you get those Dinos to vote against it so you can have your people run against them? What it seems like is we've had a bunch of welfare queens in Congress. We've had basically Democrats living unconditionally off of support from beaten down lefties and terrified African Americans. And they've been able to leverage that unconditional vote to basically end up with this kind of welfare queenish Congress. And that's unfortunate, because instead of them working and going out and doing labor, like pushing for these things, because this also shows that you could push for those things and get those things accomplished if you indeed pushed for those things, if you indeed believed in those things. You've just set the premise right here with the $2,000. Whether it passes the Senate or not is secondary to the point that I'm making. I'm making the point that leverage and the crowd matters in politics. And if you're trying to isolate it to just what is taking place in the political space, you will lose, especially if you're a lefty. This is a great precedent. And again, whether it passes in the Senate or not is secondary. And the last point, you even have lefties in this weird belief that they're the base of the Democratic Party. You have lefties and blacks that believe this. This is so utterly bizarre and it's utterly sad. Let me tell you this. When Hillary Clinton is writing those secret speeches, it's secret from you. I would put to you that the base are the people who are sitting in the room listening to her write those speeches. And you, the people who were not given privy to that, is not the base. When Joe Biden is talking to his investors and they're telling him, hey, he's telling them nothing will fundamentally change. He's telling that to them, not to you. I put to you that you've been suckered. You're not the base of the Democratic Party. You're just the people who vote for them unconditionally. The base are the ones who they fight for. The base are the ones who they basically shuck and jive for. And those are the ones who they deny you Medicare for all, or for that matter, was willing to deny you that $2,000 for. You are not their base. I had a video to show, but I'll pass it. Shane, what do you think? The $2,000, yes, and the pressure campaign that basically took place after Trump did this, and how it affected the various congressmen. What do you think about all this?
It's good to see him doing something productive. It's good to see him actually being able to get something done. And in a weird way, not exactly leading by example, because I don't know what example he can set, but he was pushing for this very clearly, as you were talking about. And it seems like all this is coming to pass because he was pushing for it. Now, if that's just optics, then that was a great little maneuver there as he's exiting the presidency, at least as he seems to be. But yeah, he successfully did this. And I would argue it is way too little, way too late. I can only hope that, in some alternative timeline, in some other universe, he was a much more productive president by doing this kind of thing more consistently. I'm one of those weird people who I don't really criticize Trump on the Russiagate grounds. Obviously, I think that whole thing is mostly baloney, entirely baloney, really, when I look at it. And I don't really, I've never really called him a white supremacist or his followers white supremacists. I don't think, not taking standard tack. I'm kind of, weirdly enough, criticizing him on grounds that the right often criticizes him on. He didn't do as much with his presidency as he could have or should have. He was a little bit too slow and too reticent. And also just, and this is a little bit of an aside, as he appears to be exiting very soon, as we're kind of closing up that term of American history, he packed his White House, his administration, with so many duplicitous foes of his, so many of his enemies, and so many sort of incompetent cronies of his. And I don't even mean crony in a seriously pejorative sense, just friends of his or whatever, who weren't qualified to do the job. And so if you're surrounded by, on the one hand, jackals and on the other fools, then you're not going to do very well. You're not going to get very far. And it's sad that that's how it went, because as far as I can tell, that is a large part of how he would have made progress, is by surrounding himself with supportive, competent people. Now, admittedly, he's coming to American politics with a sort of weird and out of date and sort of just an outside perspective on what things should be done, where we should be going. So it's not like he has a variety of think tanks with people who think like him that he can staff the administration with, unlike most other administrations. So I don't want to blame that too hard, but I guess let this be an object lesson for future presidents, that if you want to succeed in your reforms, whatever they may be, you need to have some sort of institutional basis outside of the White House you're entering, or else you're going to be filling it with people who largely disagree with you, or at the very least are coming to that White House with dramatically different ideas and policies. Anyway, we're going into a break here. We will be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Marouf. We are joined by Laith Marouf. He is an award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples, and focused on building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. Laith, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, thank you for being on with us. All right, let's start off right here. Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah appeared on TV, did an interview, and gave a kind of extensive interview. Can you just tell us briefly, what is he? This is actually a particular note, because hearkening back to your being banned from Facebook for a couple of periods there, simply for transcribing a speech of Nasrallah's. I'm going to ask you to do something that broadly parallels that. Can you sort of tell us what he said in this? What was his take? What has he seen? And just giving us a picture of where that organization, through that head of that organization, where that'll go, what their perspective on current events is. Laith.
Yeah, it was a 4-hour live interview on Al Mayadeen television with Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah. It was wide-ranging, covered not only the year, it was dubbed as a year-end, interview. but actually covered the last 10 years, basically. So there was a wealth of information that was given to the viewers. The interview was stellar. The host had a lot of unexpected questions that were put there, and so we got, on the one hand, an overview of some of the capabilities militarily of Hezbollah, and also we've heard about what is expected to come, obviously, in the next 20 days, as 20 somewhat days before Trump leaves, what everybody's expecting. I can go into details about this. There's so many gems. Obviously, as I said, the military capabilities of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, addressed the Israeli populace, told them that their leadership are lying to them, giving medals to individuals supposedly for stopping the transfer of technology, missile technology to Hezbollah. And he said that in the last 1 year, only in the last 12 months, the stockpile of Hezbollah of guided missiles and cruise missiles has tripled in the last 1 year. So he basically hinted and showed that there was a complete failure in the efforts of Israel to stop the transfer of weapons to Hezbollah, the guided missiles specifically. And he spoke about that they have used air defenses in the last few months, that they had shot down Israeli drones. They had chased them out of the airspace of Lebanon. They had taken over through electronic surveillance and hacking others, and that none of it was made public because it was just a hint to apartheid Israel on what they have in hiding for them in any possible confrontation. And as a result of it, all Israeli drones that have been violating the airspace in the last few months have been flying at very high altitude, and only if they have escorts of F-16s and F-15s to protect them. So there's a huge change in the mood of operation for these drones now in the Lebanese airspace.
I'm curious. This is, I suppose it's called asymmetric warfare. I mean, if I had to call it anything. Because Israel does have nuclear weapons. I mean, like in a out-and-out conflict, it seems like there would be this kind of overwhelming firepower from Israel. So from the standpoint of Hezbollah, and again, this is a little murky for me. I mean, Hezbollah is not the official military, even though Hezbollah basically is the military. How does Hezbollah deal with something like that? I mean, you're basically talking about, like you said, apartheid Israel. Yeah, but they have overwhelming firepower in regards to the way they operate. I mean, it's always very strange to me that Hezbollah can push these guys back and what that says about the effectiveness of the Israeli military. But I would imagine this kind of asymmetric warfare, what is the battle strategy or the plan itself that allows Hezbollah to protect Lebanon in these situations, despite the fact that Israel seems to have the greater amount of firepower?
Well, first off, apartheid Israel is a colony. It is not built on actual roots of people defending the land that they've held for centuries. It is only in existence because of imperial enforcement of its existence. Apartheid Israel brags about, on the one hand, about supposedly defeating all the Arab armies in 1948, claiming at the same time that is, surrounded by all these enemies, when in reality in 1948, the only two Arab states that were not still colonies or, occupied by Western powers were Syria and Lebanon, and just came out of the colonial stage and had, World War I rifles and homemade weapons to defend themselves, no planes, no nothing. So the change is, the reality is now there's been a democratization of weapon technology, not only media, as we saw in the last 20 some odd years, with the ability for a resistance movement to have smart weapons and have drones and be able to hack the electronic warfare of their enemy with very small budgets. And so, there's been a huge change in the whole region since 2006 and Hezbollah's defeat of the Israeli war on Lebanon, and everything that has happened in this region since 2006, including the Arab Autumn and all these Wahhabi-Contra invasions that are controlled by the CIA and the Saudis, was to change that reality that Hezbollah and the resistance axis has made. And they have failed, even though we've had like a decade of the most horrendous war crimes and 100 somewhat countries attacking Syria, along with all their mercenaries. And the axis of resistance has come out in winning, at least not being defeated. So what's coming next is that, we do speak about the Israeli nuclear weapons, but in reality, will Israel use those nuclear weapons if the empire is collapsing and is withdrawing from the region? I'm not sure. We saw the settlers in South Africa, they had nuclear weapons. And when time came to end that settlement and colonial project, the empire just took those weapons with it, as it left with its white settlers that went to Canada and the United States and Australia because they wanted to continue their maintaining of white privilege. And this is what is expected of the white settlers that happen to be Jewish that are in apartheid Israel.
Well, that's a really good point. Because I was going to make the point about basically because they're an apartheid state, any conflict with surrounding neighbors has to deal with the fact that you also have a populace in Palestine that has been horrifically treated, that if you give them weapons, they will fight. Meaning it's the same issue like in wars, in any particular war, where the internal population and internal dynamics of the population itself become a problem for the place that was basically trying to keep these guys in. But you made you made another point that I think is a little bit more interesting. The nuclear weapon stuff. When South Africa basically left, the apartheid state, when it imploded, well, you're right, they got rid of the nuclear weapons. And you don't believe that Israel will basically use those weapons. From your standpoint, what is a piecemeal? Like, what is the way to reconcile this? Because I don't necessarily think Israel is packing up and going anywhere. So how do you view this as a way to, let's say, settle this? If you were God King, Marouf, how would you go about basically saying, all right, this is how this issue gets settled?
So there's, interestingly, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah in his interview spoke specifically about the Palestinians inside the occupied territories and apartheid Israel. And one of those very important things was, in 2006, the Syrian government had purchased Cornet missiles, the anti-tank busters, and had paid for them from their own budget and donated them to Hezbollah during the war. And that is the reason the Merkava armies of apartheid Israel, their pride of their military industry was decimated, and they were not able to occupy Lebanon at the time. The Hezbollah and Syria were worried at the time that Russia was going to be angry about this transfer of weapons, but in reality, Russia was very happy for the free advertising for its weapons. And to take it one more step, General Soleimani, that was assassinated, the Iranian general, assassinated in January 3rd, 2020, he requested from Nasrallah if he can take some of those cornets to Gaza. And Nasrallah said that, well, these were a donation from Syria, so I'm going to ask Assad for his permission. And they met, and he showed to Assad how it's possible for them to get these coronettes into Gaza. And President Assad and Syria agreed to this transfer, and therefore Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza defeated the invasions of Israel in 2008 and 2014 at a huge cost for the civilians, but they stopped the invasions then. And finally, again for 2006, one of the questions that were very peculiar from the host of the interview, he asked what Hassan Nasrallah thinks about the Palestinians of 1948, the Palestinians that are citizens of the state of Israel that remained there. And he showed a huge affection to them and said these are the people that are holding to their land. These are the most courageous of the Palestinians, the ones that are want the liberation of Palestine from the sea to the river, that want a one state for everybody that's in there. And he reminded everybody that in 2006, because Hezbollah had less smart missiles, they mistakenly hit a few Arab towns and villages, Palestinian towns and villages inside Israel. And at the end of the war in 2006, Nasrallah gave a speech and he apologized to these Palestinians and offered to pay a compensation for any damages or deaths. And the Palestinians were interviewed, those people that lost families in 2006, and they said their blood is his sacrifice. As long as he throws as many rockets as he can on apartheid Israel, then he can make some of them fall on them.
Wow.
So this is a very important...
We have to take a break. I wanted to let you get that out because that's pretty profound. I mean, in just the commentary of the people. And actually was going to a question I kind of had it for the next segment. So let's take a break. Laith Marouf is award-winning multimedia producer and media policy law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonialization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples and building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Marouf. We are joined by Laith Marouf. He is an award-winning broadcaster, award-winning multimedia producer, and media policy and law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples and building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. Laith, I'm going to take a pretty hard pivot here and kind of ask a wider question. The country of Jordan, we don't ever talk about Jordan, but clearly they're right there in the region. What is their relationship militarily and diplomatically to the various conflicts rolling in the region? Laith.
So Jordan is a British colonial manufactured entity, and the royal family there, the Hashemites, are originally from Mecca. They rode with the British army against the Ottomans in World War I, and attempted to kind of relive a glory that wasn't theirs. So the promise that the British gave them was to hand them over the Arab lands of Greater Syria and Iraq and Arabia, the peninsula. And at the end of the war, actually, first off, the Arabs of Syria and Iraq rejected them. and revolted against King Faisal that came riding from Mecca into Damascus, was expelled from Damascus. And the British and the French betrayed them and cut up the region into all these fake entities, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, which are really just one land, one people, and handed over Palestine to the Zionist settlers, and eventually betrayed them again and handed weapons to Saudi Arabia to occupy Mecca and the Hijaz region, which was the original throne, basically, of the Hashemites. So you have a royal family in Jordan that is not indigenous to the land, which is protected since World War I. Even though it got its wings clipped multiple times, it still is subordinate to the British. Even in 1948, the war, if you remember, it was the Jordan supposedly participated in it, but in reality, it had the British generals in charge of its army. So did it really fight apartheid Israel and its creation? It didn't. So in the region, Jordan plays a role of a operations for the intelligence agencies. A lot of times, if you see these Al-Qaeda's and ISIS and so on, yes, the bulk work of the membership of our Saudis and other Gulf countries, but the operatives that control them are Jordanian mukhabarat. So similar with the issue of Chechnya. There's a lot of Chechens in Jordan because of the massacres that the Russian Empire did against the Chechens. A lot of them moved down all the way to Jordan. So again, the Jordanian intelligence plays a huge role in the Chechen conflict.
It's funny, the Brits during that time in that war, First World War, was promising everything to anybody. Like, they were in bad straits. Not giving an excuse, more so just the historical footnote that's a part of it. So that's fascinating. I'm curious, when these nations were broken up, and they were like, basically Britain drew lines on a map, and they were trying to separate the world based on these kind of ethnic grounds. But the problem, of course, is you're always going to have a certain amount of people partition into another country. So it's like, all right, 70% of this particular nationality, but then we have 20 or 30%. Meaning they were never able to do this nationalism stuff in the way that they were trying to make these kind of national borders. What were the politics in these countries when these borders were drawn like this on a map, and just kind of the people were all of a sudden in a different place afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, the difference for what happened to the Arab people is that these are peoples that are divided in different countries that are the same population. It's not like, let's say, somewhere in Africa where there's a part of a nation on one side of the border and another on the other side. Here you have 22 countries of the same ethnicity, cultural, ethnic group, linguistic group being divided into 22 countries, and it's the main reason is to not allow them to have territorial continuity, market economics that could be viable, and or geopolitics that are influential on international affairs. In the situation of not only the Arab world, but the most of the world, also the borders are like straight lines that don't follow any natural borders. So it was ridiculous. And it changed the whole Arabic world, because no matter who was in charge of the Arab world over the last 40,000 years, there was no borders prior to World War I. A human movement was there, and people just were encased within natural borders, majorities of populations. So there was, people, moving from one side to the other of the Arabic world, marrying into each other, and the culture was continuously growing, and now it's encased in these fake state borders that diminish their ability to grow.
It's the application of the rule of the nation state through colonialism. I mean, at this point, we're not living 100, 200 years ago. What are sort of, I'll use the word ideologues. What are people with ideas about how the political and economic systems of that part of the world, what are they envisioning? What do they see? What are some names that I could look into if I wanted to figure out what a sort of modern vision for a post-colonial, post-nation state era would look like in that part of the world? Like,
so there's really three main wells of political thought in the Arab world. So you have Syrian nationalism, this idea of unifying greater Syria, the geographic location that includes the Fertile Crescent. You have Arab nationalism or patriotism that envisions even a bigger encompassing hold. And then you have the Islamic Muslim thought of statehood. And so obviously the West saw the Arab or Syrian nationalism as the greatest threat. And since World War I, attempted to birth a Muslim political movement that is subverted and to their needs as an imperial rule. And we see that pendulum going back and forth between the two, depending on the power that is. And lately, with the defeat of the Arab Spring or the Arab Autumn, what it offered from death squads and so forth, in the name of Islamic polity, means that now the only possible avenue that people are going to go to is Arab unification and Syrian unification schools of thought. And that's what's happening on the ground. And this is why we see the rush by these Gulf countries to become openly aligned with Israel because they're scared to hell. Their brand of politics that they were selling on behalf of the empire, the Muslim Brotherhood or Wahhabi schools, have been discredited in live television of mass slaughter and rape. So people are coming back to that school, and this is what's the changes that are happening on the ground right now.
That's so wild. You really believe that the countries will reunify because I think after a certain amount of time, you get this thing where the countries find themselves as countries, meaning there's a certain nationalism that takes off where they identify with the country, or at the very least there are movements that go along with it. For example, Hong Kong, where these guys are holding up a British flag, it's like ignoring what Hong Kong went through and what China went through at the hands of the Brits trying to force in opium. But at a certain point, Hong Kong becomes a thing unto itself. Is this not the same thing for the governments? Meaning, whether you're talking about Syria, whether you're talking about Lebanon, where they identify themselves as Syria and as Lebanon, despite the origins of the countries. You really think there's a movement for these countries to reunify in a certain way? Well, about 2 minutes.
For sure. I mean, on the one hand, you're going to school, no matter what regime is in power, when they're going to teach you poetry and history, they have no choice but to make you read pre-Islamic poetry, Muslim poetry, Arabic, and so forth. You have to read and these ideas are 40,000 years. It's not, you can't just bring 100 years of colonial power and expect it, no matter what they do. This is the reality. There's a language that is common between all these people. There's a common history of 40,000 years. Nothing is going to change it in colonial matters. This is a blip in history, 100 years of colonialism in the Arabic world. Even the Roman occupation was 6 times that, 600 years of it, and it couldn't stop the people from being unified.
You know what, Laith? It's just we're about out of time. I could ask a follow-up question. This specifically is an interesting conversation. This is fascinating. I'd love to follow up some other time. Also, I don't think we've mentioned Nasserism, and this is just fascinating stuff to learn more about. In general, like the history of the ideologies of the 20th century. I understand that the history you're pointing to is much older in many cases, but particularly it seems like we are in large part still viewing this through the 19th and 20th century's political ideologies. And it's just interesting looking forward at what that might look like, particularly as British and American influence do seem to be pretty sharply fading in the region. And so the sort of wake of colonialism, their wake, might be leaving, might be ending. Anyway, we have to call it here. We're joined for this segment by Laith Marouf. Laith, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me again, guys.
Fascinating conversation. He is an award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples, and focused on building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. You're also listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We will be back in 1 minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, U.S. COVID cases have officially passed 19 million. Yesterday, in the United States, 1,345 more people died from the virus, bringing the U.S. total deaths 332,246. Spain's health minister said his country plans to collect and share with other European Union nations information about residents who decide not to get vaccinated for COVID-19, the country's health minister said on Monday. He stressed that vaccination would not be compulsory, but that a register will be set up that would include all people who turned down the vaccine after being called up for vaccination by Spain's public health service. In an interview with the Spanish television channel, he said that, quote, "This is not a public document and it wouldn't be done with the highest respect for data privacy," unquote. His comments come a day after Spain launched a vaccination program with the goal of vaccinating 2.5 million people between January and March, all of them with priority health groups, starting out with residents of nursing homes and healthcare professionals who care for those residents. Yeah, Shane, we were talking about this before. I have problems with this. I mean, basically, they're calling people up, and if the person says no, then they're writing down, okay, this person declined the vaccine. If you're doing that, you're doing that for a reason. It's not innocuous. It's not for no reason. Either it's to put public pressure that this document might be known, this document may be seen, this document may be leaked. It's one thing if you had a record of people who were getting the vaccine and you left it at that. It feels darker to also keep a record of the people who basically declined to get it. I don't know. Like if you went to an airport and the airport asked you, do you have a vaccine? And let's say you had a card or some kind of identification, identifying such. That's one thing. For some reason, it feels darker to put all of these people on a list. Even if this is completely innocuous, it just feels darker. So I could be wrong, and maybe I'm overtly cynical on this stuff. But yeah, I have problems with lists, especially the stuff in statute and whatnot. Let's do this. We can come back to it and talk to it for a moment, but I just want to get through some of these because there's one in particular that I want to talk about. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced new, tougher coronavirus restrictions the day after the country recorded more than 1 million COVID-19 cases. Indoor and outdoor gatherings will be banned, a curfew introduced from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., and alcohol sales will be prohibited. Mr. Ramaphosa said the country was an extremely dangerous point in the pandemic and action had to be taken. Recently, authorities confirmed that a new, faster-spreading variant of the virus had been detected in South Africa. The House of Representatives on Monday passed a measure to increase stimulus checks for Americans under a certain income level to $2,000 after President Donald Trump championed the effort, sending the bill to the Senate, where its future is far less certain. The legislation, which passed with 275 to 134 vote, comes a day after Trump signed a coronavirus relief bill into law Sunday evening. The measure provides $600 in direct payments, but after a deal was brokered and passed out of Congress, Trump railed against the amount was too low and rallied for $2,000 checks, instead prompting House Democrats to push for an increase. Senator Bernie Sanders has threatened to delay a crucial vote to override Trump's veto on a defense funding bill unless Senate holds a vote on the $2,000 checks. Shane, God, man, I love that. Because under normal circumstances...
It's a standoff.
It's a standoff. And under normal circumstances, what you get is, we'll pass this defense bill without even a second thought. I don't even need to be there. Just have my secretary just automatically put that as a yes anytime that comes up. And so Sanders is like, if you want to override the veto to fund the military, you are going to have to pass these $2,000 checks. Love that. I love that. It's exactly what you should do. It's politics. You're going to cede to my needs. And unless you cede to my needs, your needs aren't going to get met. That's politics 101.
And it's here. This is horseshoe theory would almost be a way to cap it off and dismiss it or something like that. But I just want to point out Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were very close to going up against each other in 2016 as the presidential nominees in that election. They are now effectively working together on this issue, while the most of the rest of Congress, the vast majority of Congress, has just sort of sat out and gone along with the, wherever the water would take them. Isn't that remarkable?
It is remarkable.
Great.
It is remarkable. And I keep just, they try to make it look like, well, Donald Trump is just mad that Pelosi didn't take his $1.8 trillion. And I'm like, why wouldn't he be mad? You guys negotiated in bad faith for like 6 months. And then at the last month, all of a sudden, we got to get this done now. And it's like, so yeah, why wouldn't he be mad about that? But beyond that point, is he right? And I think he is right. And so yeah, it is very weird that the two people basically agree. And they asked Joe Biden and say, hey, Biden, do you agree with 2,000? And then this kind of offhanded walking away, yeah. Keep in mind, Biden was the guy that basically made it okay for Pelosi to shame herself and take half of what she said was entirely unacceptable before. So, yeah, it's weird politics, but Sanders still fighting. U.S. District Judge Allison Nathan, in a brief order on Monday, has denied Ghislaine Maxwell's second attempt at pretrial release, concluding that none of the new information altered the court's previous determination that Maxwell, an alleged co-conspirator of deceased sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, posed a flight risk if granted bail. Maxwell's legal team spent months preparing what they billed as, quote, a comprehensive bail package, unquote, containing substantial information that was not available to present to the court at Maxwell's detention hearing in July. Several friends and family, whose names were redacted from the public court filing, had pledged assets and offered to co-sign the bond. The renewed bail application also confirmed for the first time that Maxwell, 59, has been married since 2016 to Scott Bogerson, the founder of a maritime investment company called Cargo Metrics and former fellow in residence at the Council of Foreign Relations. Very interesting. It's as if she does not understand the scenario to which she is presented with to believe that any court is going to let her out, considering who they believe Epstein is. Meaning, they didn't get their hands on Epstein. She's the closest thing to Epstein. So whatever lens they look at her with, they're looking at her through that same lens, meaning she's not going anywhere.
This is okay. I'm going to throw in something. This is kind of coming out of almost completely nowhere, except it has to do with Ghislaine Maxwell, and it ties together the conversation we were just having with Laith Marouf. We're talking about Israel. I don't think we mentioned this yet, but there's the idea of the Samson option, which comes from this 1991 book by the journalist Seymour Hersh, in which the idea is if Israel is facing an all-out invasion, they can launch their nukes in a sort of all-out retaliatory attack against whichever country or countries are invading them. And it's sort of like a last gasp defense policy that comes naturally with the idea of nuclear weapons. Anyway, Cy Hirsch wrote this book. He was talking about this a month after in the book he mentions Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, and says that basically Robert Maxwell has ties to the Mossad. A month later, he dies. Robert Maxwell dies in a sort of mysterious drowning after he supposedly falls off his yacht. Anyway, always been noted as a mysterious death. A lot of people think that was a homicide of some kind or another. Question is by whom? By which party? Again, this is admittedly out of nowhere, but it ties together those two conversations. I'm just wondering, what are the details? Why did he die then? If he was killed, what was the timing there? Because a lot of people, of course, when they're talking about Ghislaine Maxwell, and they're talking about Jeffrey Epstein, they're talking about potential intelligence connections, potentially Mossad connections. So, was it that his cover was blown and Mossad took him out? That's one sort of very trivial and almost certainly inaccurate take on it. What was it? I feel like there are at least several books that could be written, especially in light of the Jeffrey Epstein story coming out to wider attention. And if anybody has some leads, I'm open to them. My email address is shanestranahan@gmail.com. I'm literally just throwing that out. Anyway,
fascinating. I mean, but you're right. I mean, there was those connections. Seymour Hersh, by the way, phenomenal reporter, phenomenal newsman. And he's the one that made the point about the reason that Obama pulled back from the Syrian weapon strikes is because Obama knew that Turkey was basically sending in weapons and that the chemical weapons didn't come from Syria. They came from the other countries trying to frame Syria. Yeah, the terrorists trying to frame Syria. That's the guy. This is Malay Massacre. That's that guy, who wrote the book on that stuff. Seymour Hersh is phenomenal as a reporter. God, I would love to get him on this channel. I'd love to get him on this channel for an interview. In his book, Absolutely. Reporter, he made point about internal restrictions, internal censorship that takes place when people realize, because people as human beings, you want to prosper in whatever you do. You want to be successful at it, even if what you're doing is not necessarily that great. But the benefits of the company and the incentives that are built within companies can push people in certain directions. Well, the same thing is true for news. And it's his point was, you have editors that basically keep sending back your work. And you get to the point of they're not interested in this. And so you start writing stuff that they might be interested in. And just the internal dynamics of getting that approval, of getting that story passed, pushes people in a direction where they stop doing certain reporting and start doing other reporting. That's stuff that you don't know unless you're working in the industry and stuff like that. But it's Seymour Hersh. I'm glad you brought him up. He's phenomenal as a reporter. Famous Senegalese American singer Akon wants to build a futuristic city in Senegal. The new $6 billion project called Akon City will be situated in the middle of a multi-municipality in Senegal, and Akon plans it to be a refuge for all members of the African diaspora. He calls the future region, quote, a real-life Wakanda, unquote, and plans to create a technology center and Cineworld in it to develop the film industry. There will be a resort, condominiums, and stadium. It also planned the city would operate on renewable energy sources and would allow mainly use Acoin, its own cryptocurrency. And after undergoing 2 years of design and development, Akon announced that construction will begin in 2021. This feels a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Ego affirming? I mean, you've named a Wakanda basically after yourself, and then you've named the currency after yourself. Is he going to have money with his face on it? How far is Akon going to go with this? And I want to just make another point. If this is going to be a refuge for all of the people in the African diaspora, who's going to be able to afford this? You're going to have condominiums, you're going to have stadiums, you're going to have all of this stuff, meaning you're going to have basically what seems to be a wealthy society in Africa, or Wakanda. But it's going to be for profit. And the catch becomes, who is going to be able to afford to live in that Wakanda? That's what, so I get the whole refugee stuff, but let's put it in context. Are the refugees with no money going to be living in the condominiums in Wakanda? And where are they going to get the A-coin to pay for those condominiums? That's what I'm curious about. On Monday, a Saudi court sentenced prominent human rights activist Lojan al-Haltoulu to 5 years and 8 months in prison on terrorism-related charges, and banned her from leaving the country for 5 years, sparking a torrent of international criticism. Lojan, 31, was arrested in May 2018 with about a dozen of other women's rights activists just weeks before the historic lifting of the decades-long ban on female drivers and reform they had long campaigned for. Now, this was the one I put in because I wanted to juxtapose this with the reporting on China, meaning AOC called for Magnitsky sanctions, basically against China. You have all of the reporting in the United States, but sanctions should be passed against China for the reporter. And look, you heard me the other day making the point that the reporter thing was horrendous, that China, if it's confident, needs to not do stuff like that. That's pretty horrendous. So this isn't me giving a woo-woo to China, putting his foot down or stamping down reporters, independent media. But I just want to show the difference in the way these things are handled. She is being basically in prison. We thought she was going to be put to death for driving and for pushing women's rights for the driving. And even though they budged on that issue, she was one of those people that got that issue passed. And basically her life is forfeit for it. There are no sanctions that are being called. There's nothing that is being done against Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia chopped the guy up with a bone saw. And the world watched. The world knew it. The world could even hear the chopping of the guy takes place in a video, the audio tapes that Turkey passed out. Nothing. And yet, all of these sanctions on China. I'm trying to show the difference in the way that countries.
Well, we did. I hear you, but that was actually like a notable exception. We did sanction the Department of Treasury sanctioned a number of individuals back in 2018 for the killing of Khashoggi. But that was like,
I'm wrong then. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm wrong then. I didn't think they sanctioned Khashoggi for the Khashoggi thing. I just remember Donald Trump asking how much money does Saudi Arabia give us, and they used the Magnitsky Act then too. That's the thing is the Magnitsky Act. I don't mean to take it off on a tangent about Magnitsky and Browder and all this stuff. No, I'm wrong. So go for it. Explain it. No.
It's just the Magnitsky Act is used for these sort of point-wise. It's almost like a drone strike, but for sanctions, where, the whole idea with the drone strike is you target specific individuals. With the Magnitsky Act, you can sanction individual people, not just entire countries, but the idea is take away their assets, take away their ability to invest in your country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's how that worked. And those 17 individuals were sanctioned back in 2018 for their roles in the Khashoggi killing.
Interesting. Okay, fair enough. That's fair enough. Was one of those individuals the person who ordered it? No,
I don't. No, I don't think.
Because I don't think it was. I think the people who were sanctioned, if they were sanctioned, had to do with the people who supposedly carried it out, not the guy who ordered it. But I could be. But again, I could be wrong. But let's do this. You guys are listening. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's go into the break because we've ran a little bit over. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with your hosts, Shane Stranahan, Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Joining us, Glory Jones, political activist, organizer, and one of the co-hosts of the Slow News Day podcast. As an on-the-ground activist, she fights for causes such as Julian Assange and free press, black liberation, anti-imperialism, and anti-national security state actions. Glory, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about Assange, that basically free expression depends on the release of Assange. Let me ask you this. Why don't you think at this point Donald Trump gives a pardon? I mean, like, it's one thing when he comes into office and you have this scenario where it's like Trump is working with the Russians and everybody's screaming it to the hilt. And because everybody's screaming it, there's a disincentive for him to do anything like that with Assange, despite saying he loved WikiLeaks. At that point, he was like, what's WikiLeaks? Because at that point, all of the heat was on him. He wanted to distance himself from the Assange stuff. Well, at this point, you've lost the race. All of the Russiagate stuff have went belly up. And it even was released that Donald Trump apparently was going to give Assange a pardon if he released the information saying it wasn't the Russians. So it's like all of this stuff is out there at this point. There's even the clip of Assange bringing up Seth Rich in an interview. Like, so it's like the moment that all of this stuff comes out there, what's the hedge for Trump to give this pardon? He has nothing to lose at this point. And I agree with you. Press freedom almost depends or demands that Assange is released. What's his holdup right now? And of course, you don't know as a flat fact, but what's your thinking on his holdup?
Yeah, well, I mean, the hope right now is that Assange can receive a pardon from President Trump, just because at the moment, you know, there is more hope of him receiving a pardon from Trump than there is from Biden, who undoubtedly is already stacking his cabinet with some of the most sociopathic, technocratic, and just soulless servants of the oligarchy. But I mean, all indications has shown throughout this 4 years with President Trump that despite all his talk, he's still a tool of the surveillance state, like every other president of the United States has been. You know, he's employed Mike Pompeo,
the weakest strong man ever, basically. It's like this is a strong man. He doesn't seem to be all that strong.
And on top of that, it was revealed via the Cassandra Fairbanks testimony in court over these past couple weeks of extradition hearings in September and going into a bit of October, that the arrest of Assange and the raid of the Ecuadorian embassy, which kind of, you know, dragged him out of there after being arbitrarily detained in there for years, it was done at the behest of the president. Cassandra Fairbanks revealed it via her call with Arthur Schwartz, where he's essentially warning her ahead of time that Assange is going to be arrested at the behest of Donald Trump. So evidence revealed in court indicates that Donald Trump is very much aware of the position Assange is in, and he's very much aware of the fact that he wants him arrested. Now, I mean, at this point, whether he did that at the behest of the people in his cabinet, which he's undeniably been a tool of, that's up to the question. But we're at the point now where we're just trying to have him freed by any means necessary. His partner and fiance, Stella Morris, she already asked for a presidential pardon, and we're just hoping that we can do what he can to secure Julian's freedom at this point, because we really don't have time. You know, the decision in his case is to come on the 4th.
Well, Glory, that's kind of my point. All the incentives in the beginning, at least from the standpoint of Trump, was to show that I am not a tool of the Russian government, because everybody kept saying he was. Like, that was basically the mantra that was taking place. And so he gets to the point of saying, all right, how do I push back? Like, this is politics 101. Like, Nixon can go to China. Or you can have Bill Clinton that can get rid of Glass-Steagall. But a Republican would have trouble passing NAFTA, those type of things. It's like the party gives them leeway just because of the ideological beliefs that are associated with the party. So basically, Trump pushing back is Trump saying, I didn't have anything to do with this. I am against this and everything else. Like, it seems to be the politics demanded it. But at this point, the politics don't demand any of it. Shane?
Yeah, well, I mean, at this point, it has to come from essentially a pressure campaign by the people. That's my belief in what's going to happen. Because if this case hasn't been literally thrown out, considering that American intelligence agencies have literally spied on Assange and have had access to his legal arguments through UC Global contracts, then it's clear that this isn't a fair trial. It's super clear that this isn't a speedy trial. It's asinine that Assange be subjected to U.S. laws, but not constitutional guarantees of a fair and speedy trial, because it's disgusting what he's going through now. He's in prison. It's, winter in London, and he's freezing there. He's having to use books in his cell to board them up against his window to keep him warm. He has a chronic lung condition, so he's incredibly at risk of COVID. And he was denied bail earlier this summer because they determined him a flight risk for some reason, despite the fact that at multiple stages in his arbitrary detention, torture, and imprisonment, he's shown a willingness to be able to cooperate with governments in the work of WikiLeaks and in the work of, securing his freedom and safety, because that's just within his character to do so.
Ms. Jones, thank you for joining us. I mean, I want to come back just briefly to the hints that Trump is not only considering, but would soon be pursuing pardon of Assange. You have Rudy Giuliani and Sarah Palin. And Sarah Palin coming out and saying that she believes that Assange should be pardoned, that she apologized for having attacked him back, of course, after he had released her details, over a decade ago, during the 2008 presidential election. Anyway, that was just striking. And Rudy Giuliani on TV, again, Trump's lawyer, defending Assange for a solid couple of minutes, which is both of these are suggestive, but nothing seems to be coming to pass quite yet. Just very briefly, and I want to follow up with another question, but why do you think those have come out? Why do you think they've done that? And yet Trump is still not doing anything. So you can't put it any other way. What's your take?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not incredibly attached to, Trump world, but I have talked to a lot of Trump supporters, and many Trump supporters and many people in his, main circle are very much supportive of Assange, regardless of what the reason is, whether they believe that they need him to expose, all the election fraud and rigging that happened this time around, or based off of support for the DNC leaks back in 2016. So his supporters are very much sympathetic to Assange. It's funny because I actually recall Katie Hopkins making a better statement calling for the immediate release and medical care of Julian Assange than Bernard Sanders. So I found that to be almost ironic in the fact that many Trump supporters are sympathetic to the plight of Assange. So from that standpoint, there's kind of a lot of buzz going around in the Trump world that they are considering a pardon. And I know many prominent Trump supporters are hoping that he'll, do the right thing and, walk, albeit he was the one that detained Assange and imprisoned him in the first place. But a lot of people are still hoping that he pardon Assange within those people who are within his circle are hoping that he'll pardon Assange just because they're sympathetic to him already.
And I've seen that. You mentioned Cassandra Fairbanks. I think she would qualify at this point as a Trump supporter anyway. I mean, although specifically his treatment of Assange has tampered with that, like you've been talking about. I mean, another way of looking at this, we had a guest on the other day who was saying the vast majority of Americans, at a simple majority, but probably a super majority, would be in favor of a pardon or a release of Julian Assange. I think they're right. I think that a lot of people despite what the Democratic Party and what the establishment media were saying back in 2016, 2017, trying to associate Russia and Assange, trying to basically drag him down through this association with a government that we were villainizing. I think nevertheless, a lot of people still want him free. Looking at this as an activist in our last minute or two here, how would you take that? How would you take, the small but vocal minority of folks who are strong advocates of Assange, and specifically of pardoning him? How can you take that energy and get the wider public, which would probably be in favor of releasing him, to give the public support, the vocal support that you would need to get Trump or another public official to take action and actually pardon him?
Well, first of all, I just want to mention there's going to be a huge events in D.C. January 3rd and 4th. Action for Assange, one of the national groups that are doing a lot of activism and action for Assange. They're going to be outside the British Embassy on January 3rd and outside the Department of Justice on January 4th in D.C. to essentially protest whatever the decision is. Hopefully it's a celebration because he won't be extradited, but they are going to be there. They're going to be in D.C. If anybody else is in the D.C. area, I highly suggest that they come through and just make noise in support of Assange. And what it's going to take from activists is just being able to really talk to anyone we can and try to spread awareness of this case by any means necessary, because what this issue is it's a really post-partisan issue that can garner a lot of support from all kinds of political spectrums and all kinds of ideologies. I've talked with everyone from, every sort of the spectrum. I've been to Black Lives Matter protests talking about this, and I've even showed up at Stop the Steal rallies to talk about this, and everyone there's a common thread of people being sympathetic to Assange, whether it's coming from a standpoint of wanting to prevent the increase of the national security state and the surveillance state, or just from the standpoint of needing Assange to expose, the establishment further. But either way, it's just going to take a massive on-the-ground effort to be able to talk to those around us, regardless of political ideology and regardless of what you think of a person, because Julian doesn't exactly have the time for us to be picky in who we're looking for and who we're allying ourselves with. We just have to be able to ally ourselves with the people in front of us, with the people around us of all political ideologies, and just band together and kind of hope that we can make a massive push for a pressure campaign to really make some noise.
I think you're right. We need to close it out here, but I think you're right. There is a massive potential. There is a potential for post-partisan support pretty much all corners, particularly the corners. The center is, even though there's a lot of support there, I think they're relatively co-opted in many cases by the establishment media. Anyway, we need to close it out here. The voice you are listening to is Glory Jones, political activist, organizer, and one of the co-hosts of the Slow News Day podcast. As an on-the-ground activist, she fights for causes such as Julian Assange and the free press, black liberation, anti-imperialism, and anti-national security state actions. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break, talking with Alexander Mercouris. Be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is one of my favorite guests, Alexander Mercouris. editor-in-chief at theduran.com. Alexander, welcome back to the show, man.
Delighted to be with you again.
Absolutely. So Boris got his deal. He got his deal. Now, our expectations, or at least my expectation, was for bluster, brinksmanship, but at the end of the day, getting a deal, because I didn't think the no-deal Brexit was something that either side wanted. So what's in this deal? And on the second note, does this deal spell the end of the United Kingdom?
Right. Well, let's deal with the deal first. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we had an awful lot of bluster, a lot of brinkmanship, but a deal was done, and it's basically a deal between Britain and the European Union, and more practically between Britain and Germany, because Germany, of course, is the driving force within the European Union. And when you go over this deal, you see the German interests have been protected, British interests have been protected to a certain extent, and other countries across the EU basically have been written out of the story. Essentially, the British have been able to retain an arrangement whereby they have now a free trade agreement with the EU. They can import goods and export goods to the EU. There's zero tariffs. There will still be regulatory checks and those kind of things, and they will still have to, a great extent, align their own standards with the EU standards. And of course that means that the EU will, in effect, retain a major pull over the way the British economy works. But it is not quite as tight as some people had expected. It gives the British the option, especially if they give notice, to start moving away from the EU at their own pace, if that is what they want to do. If they start making deals with other countries, if they forge ahead with a free trade deal with the US, then they won't need the trade with the EU that they have at the moment, and they'll be able to start detaching themselves ever further away from the EU. But in the meantime, the Germans will be able to continue to export their cars, their washing machines, their various sophisticated appliances to Britain. Britain is one of their biggest markets, if not, by some estimates, their biggest market. Angela Merkel apparently refers to Britain privately as Treasure Island, because Germany runs this enormous surplus with Britain, trade surplus with Britain, and that, I think, will continue. And so she safeguarded German interests. Boris Johnson has got a deal which enables him both to avoid a no-deal Brexit and to chart a course for further detachment from the EU, if that's what he wants. And we will see how this pans out. It is not the end of the affair. There is still the option for Britain in this agreement to reintegrate more deeply with the EU again. It will be fairly straightforward to rejoin the EU if that's what a future British government decides to do, assuming that the arrangements that we now have remain in place. But it gives the British a way out, and it preserves the German trade surplus. Will Britain itself break up? Oddly enough, I take a slightly counterfactual view here. I think it less likely that it will, because I think that one of the major causes of Scottish independence sentiment was the feeling that since more and more decisions were being taken in Brussels and fewer in London, Scotland could actually secede from the United Kingdom and align with Brussels and with the EU, and it would be an easy thing to do, and they didn't need London anymore. Now that Britain is leaving the EU, it's more difficult to make that argument, and I think there will be more people in Scotland who will say to themselves, we need political representation in London, because ultimately England remains far and away Scotland's most important economic partner, and we need to maintain some sort of a voice in London. So I think you will see an upward bump in pro-independence sentiment in Scotland over the next few months, and then I predict that gradually that will start to recede.
So this is a slightly strange question to ask, but how predictable would you say British politics is right now? If you were trying to determine the heading of the British ship of state at this point, politically, I mean, on the other side of this trade deal, how strong is the current leadership? How strong is Boris Johnson? How strong are the Tories? The Labour Party seems to be in a state of disrepair. From that, you might think, okay, well, you're going to have a Tory majority. You're going to have a Tory-led country for a bit. But is that true? Do you think it's predictable, or do you think it's all up in the air? Alexander, what's your take?
It's never very clear because, of course, there's a lot of hostility to the Conservatives, to the Tory party. There's an awful lot of hostility to Johnson. Many people in Britain cannot forgive Johnson for the fact that he's taken Britain out of the EU. It's important to remember that there is a very strong pro-EU sentiment within Britain. He's also managed to antagonize young people even more by this deal by taking Britain out of the Erasmus program, which is an important totemic issue for young people. It's a mechanism whereby British students are able to study for a year in European universities and vice versa. And it was a useful thing. It was something that a lot of British people were attracted to and liked doing. So he's got a lot of opposition, and he's got a lot of opposition within the Conservative Party, which has never gone away. And, of course, there's a widespread perception, a widespread feeling that he's not managed the coronavirus crisis at all well, with British policy changing and shifting ground constantly and all the time, and people very exasperated by it. But he does have this enormous advantage, which is that the Labour Party at the moment is not providing any effective opposition at all. It is deeply divided within itself between Starmerites and Corbynites, and Starmer himself has not been able to provide a clear sense of direction as to where he wants to take Labour. He has said that he's going to back Boris Johnson's deal and instruct Labour MPs to vote for it. Many Labour MPs are, of course, strong Remainers. They're already saying they may rebel. There's already talk that some of the arch Remainers within the shadow cabinet will resign rather than follow Starmer's lead. So in the absence of a strong and purposeful Labour Party, which gives a convincing impression that it's ready to form an alternative government, I have to say that at the moment, the Conservatives look secure. Perhaps Johnson himself less so, but ultimately, it doesn't seem to me, whoever becomes Conservative leader, assuming Johnson falls and is replaced by someone else, it doesn't seem to me that there is any real challenge at the moment to the Conservative Party's hegemony in Britain. It looks very consolidated, more so, I have to say, than it has ever appeared in my lifetime. Even in Margaret Thatcher's heyday, it didn't look as strong as this, because, at least in Margaret Thatcher's heyday, there was a Labour Party that opposed her. At this moment, there doesn't even seem to be that.
Alexander, you are like my go-to on British politics. In fact, when we bring people on the show, it's like you're the person who I want to talk to about it, because you tend to be so on point with this. I know for me, watching outside of it and looking at what was taking place to Jeremy Corbyn when he was running in that race, I have to be honest, hearing you talk about this is infuriating, because Corbyn was in a situation, especially from people like Starmer, where he was in a box. He couldn't go where he wanted to go, meaning to fulfill the obligation of, we're going to do Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Meaning, because of the party members behind him and the Remainers, he got and took that weird, bizarre position that he was somehow going to abdicate a choice. Consider that. The leader of the opposition, the leader of the party, not making a choice and sending a bunch of people that don't believe in Brexit to negotiate Brexit. And this is what he had to fight on in regards to the race. And now Starmer is saying, okay, yeah, we'll accept the deal for Boris. Oh, that's aggravating to me. That's aggravating to me. How do you see that? Because you're right. Regardless of the deep divisions from Boris, there is no opposition in real terms to Boris and to the Conservative Party.
Well, I think you put your finger on it, because I think seeing things from a distance, you perhaps understand more about British politics than some people in Britain do, because what the problem is that Corbyn represented an alternative, an attractive alternative, one which fired the popular imagination, one which gave the Labour Party this huge rise in support during the 2017 general election. And his party, or at least the leadership of his party, the parliamentary leadership of his party, never accepted him. They never recognised that he was actually popular in the country, that his ideas had traction in the country, and they did everything they possibly could to undermine him. At the same time, they made the issue of the EU and essentially of keeping Britain in the EU absolutely central to their opposition to Corbyn, partly because they believed it, but also partly because they knew that would create a problem between Corbyn and much of the party membership, which was pro-EU. So he was boxed into this absurd policy of a second referendum, which it's now known for a fact he didn't believe in, and he was sure would lead to major problems for the Labour Party, and indeed it did. It cost the Labour Party basically last year's general election. Now, of course, what Starmer and those same people who were using the EU issue against Corbyn have done is that they've done something which, had he tried to do it, they would have completely slaughtered him over it. They're now saying that they're going to be more anti-EU than Corbyn ever dared to be by backing Boris Johnson's deal. They wouldn't back Theresa May's much more, pro-EU deal.
But they're going to back Boris. That's astonishing. Man, that's cutthroat politics. Alexander Mercouris is editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Alexander Mercouris. Alexander, I want to get back to this conversation. We're talking about trade in the last segment and more broadly British politics. You briefly mentioned that the perception is that Boris Johnson has mishandled this coronavirus crisis. He has bungled it, so to speak. And this comes as just before Christmas, dozens of countries around the world, many countries in Europe, closed their borders to the UK over news that a new and potentially more infectious strain of coronavirus was spreading. I just want to do a brief summary for folks who've only been loosely following how the UK, how Bojo has responded to the spread of COVID. If you had to do a comparison between the United States and the UK, what policies did they have in common? What did they not? Broadly, what has the sort of trajectory, the story been with how the British government has responded to this?
I think it is actually very similar to the US in the sense that Boris Johnson, I think, viscerally, like Donald Trump, did not want to impose lockdowns or restrictions. I think he was always worried about the economy. I think he was always very, very easily persuaded by the very strong libertarian faction within the Conservative Party, just as the Republican Party in the US has a libertarian faction, so does the Conservative Party here in Britain. And I think that fundamentally and deep down, initially back in March, he didn't want to impose a lockdown, and he resisted imposing it despite getting ever stronger advice from his scientists that he should impose it. So he didn't impose it. The result was that there was a very, very high incidence of COVID in Britain in the late spring and early summer. Eventually, he did impose a lockdown that did bring things under control. Partly, I think he did that because, he saw people falling ill around him, and eventually, of course, he fell ill and had a near-death experience himself. But then afterwards, come the summer, he began to ease off very fast, very much as much in the same way as has happened in the US, and has been extremely reluctant since then to bring back restrictions, despite again being told over the course of the autumn that it was time for him to do so. So when the second wave, if you can call it that, struck in Britain in the autumn, once more, Britain was unprepared. Eventually, as it became clear, I think, that the vaccines that he was hoping for were going to be delayed, he was forced to bring in a lockdown, a very tough lockdown in England, and he announced that in a very abrupt and, frankly, confusing way just a few days before the Christmas holiday. And I think that came as a shock to many people, and it lost him a lot of support. So there is a widespread feeling that Britain has achieved the worst possible outcome. The economy has been completely destabilized as a result of this, stop-go approach that he has taken. And at the same time, because lockdowns have not been imposed in a consistent way, the death rates and the infection rates have spiraled upwards. I will make one observation. I think it was more possible to criticize Johnson for this inconsistency in the spring and early summer than it is now. If you follow what's been happening across Europe, frankly, it looks very similar in Europe to what it looks here in Britain. I think British people perhaps are not aware of the extent to which policy in Europe has followed a very similar trajectory to that in Britain and has not actually been that different from the US.
I think the thing is, you have capitalist countries, and those countries, the lifeblood is the economy, right? I mean, that's the main point. That's the highest aspiration in this stuff. And yet you have a disease, real thing, that basically puts all of that in question. All of these people are getting sick. All of these people are dying. All of these people have additional illnesses, etc. I was looking at Britain's thing earlier. I mean, you guys have gotten, effectively, the hospitals are just as full, if not more so, than the first wave that Britain was receiving. I mean, so I get this kind of complex position that world leaders are in, where it's like, okay, what do we do? If we shut down the economy, it is going to hurt a lot of people. And so we need to fund that. Okay, do we have the money to fund that, et cetera? And so it's kind of, the logic goes from there. So they get a little conflicted in regards to what to do. But at this point, it seems like it's the worst of both worlds. It's people fighting, saying they don't want to wear masks and they don't like the shutdowns. Boris doing the shutdowns to some degree, but the shutdowns not being adequate, or the measures not being adequate. And so the thing spirals. And so it's like the weapon that was being used become almost inefficient because that weapon is the only thing that you have, and yet it's still out of control. Like, how's the country, or better yet, how's the populace dealing with that? I mean, because Shane is making a good point. Basically, all of the borders around the UK were basically shut down.
Yes. I think you've got it exactly right. I think if I can say, this is exactly the problem. If the lockdown policy, this is my own personal view, if the lockdown policy that was introduced, not just in Britain, but across Europe in the spring had been pursued consistently until the amount of virus that was circulating had been brought down to very, very low levels. And I mean just a few incidents, a few cases like you saw in China. And if that had been combined with a strong testing system, and I don't mean, couples of hundreds of thousands of tests a day, I mean, millions of tests a week, then I think by the summer, the problem with the virus would have been contained and probably brought to an end, as it has been in China. And I think we would have seen a much stronger economic rebound. But the problem was that no government anywhere in the West had that kind of consistency or singleness of purpose. They constantly sought a middle way between lockdowns and, supporting the economy. They found themselves under intense pressure from business lobbies that were very resistant to lockdowns. And, of course, on top of that, they also found that they had to dole out vast sums of money to sustain stock markets because they're now very invested in maintaining the financial system and the major beneficiaries of the financial system, because that's what they see their primary role as being. So the result was they got the worst of all worlds. They've got a system where we go in and out of lockdown, putting constant pressure on the economy instead of one, big single push which would have brought the virus down and then allowed the economy to reopen properly. So we've had this constant debilitating stop-go with lockdowns, and at the same time, the virus situation has got completely out of hand. And I'm afraid the effect is profound demoralization, a sense of growing weariness with on the part of the population. I speak of Britain because this is where I live, but I understand it's very true across the rest of Europe also. Growing resistance on the part of people to observing what rules are imposed because people no longer have any faith in the policies that the governments have introduced, and also, I think, growing gamble on the success of vaccines, because the vaccines now realistically look the only way out. I don't think it's very different in the US. It's certainly that way in Europe, and it's absolutely that way in Britain.
It's just, I think you're right. I'm, across the Atlantic, I can only get so much of the temper of the room, but it seems that there, like you're saying, a distrust not only in national governments, but in the European Union as a sort of super state construct as a whole. What do you think this whole process forebodes for the EU over the next, say, decade? Looking back on this pandemic, assuming we get out of it cleanly, which I assume we will within a few years with the vaccines and wider efforts. How do you think the EU is going to fare as a unit, Alexander?
My own view is it's going to be weakened. Now, I say that, though, of course, many people are saying that this is its, Hamilton moment. This is the opportunity it has to assert itself across the whole of Europe and to organise and coordinate a response to the pandemic crisis. It's completely failed to do that. At the moment, it isn't even able to organise vaccines, mass vaccinations properly, with the result that they're being delayed. So it's being a extraordinary, chaotic response from the EU, whilst at the same time it provides funding to EU governments, but nowhere near on the scale that's needed to actually lift the governments and the economies of Southern Europe, but which is eroding support for the EU.
He dropped.
Yeah, we might have
just
lost him. I think we lost him.
Sounds like we just lost him.
It's okay. It was maybe about 2 or 3 minutes left, and Macaris is always great on that stuff. We may be able to get him back at some other point, because at this point it's only like 2 or 3 minutes left. The voice.
Yeah, I mean, go for it.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Let's close them out. I was gonna commentate on that briefly. The voice you were listening to is Alexander Mercouris, co-founder, editor-in-chief of theduran.com. You can follow Alexander's work with The Duran on Twitter at theduran_com, The Duran on YouTube, and on their website, theduran.com. Again, that was Alexander Mercouris. We lost him mid-sentence there. I think we were talking at the end about the fate of the EU as a whole. He was talking about people's distrust in their governments, but I think there's a distrust in pretty much every institution that's complicit in the mishandling of this virus. And that's a lot of institutions around the world. I think we can see that in the United States, where people don't just distrust Donald Trump, they distrust their state governments. And in a lot of cases, they don't just distrust the CDC, they distrust the World Health Organization. So it's this collective breakdown in the credibility of institutions across the board. Of course, that has fit the trajectory of trust in those institutions over decades. And I mean, the question here is, is there going to be some larger reparative process? What's going to come out of this? Jamarl, you have any optimism here? We've got to close it out, but what's your take?
Well, I don't know if there's this mass distrust in the World Health Organization and CDC. I mean, there may be 20%. I mean, if you put it in perspective, or 25%. Like, I don't know if that's mass or that's considered mass, but maybe that 25% is a lot of people, so fair enough. I'm just talking about in comparison to the whole. Look, I think people do, for the most part, believe in science. I think the problem, it becomes difficult when those institutions let you down, because it seems like they were functioning not entirely in the interest of the public, but in the interest of some other force. And that's, I think, the problem. So that's where I come in at it. But you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with headlines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition, our last hour of this day's edition of the most disruptive show covering news and events across our divided states, as well as across the fractured surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get into the headlines. Jamarl, we should come back to this conversation later. I am sending you the link that I will be using. This is what I would say is a decline in trust in the CDC and Fauci. This is just a couple seconds searching. I want to go back and look for more on the World Health Organization, but I wanted to give you a chance to read it before we talk about it. This will probably be towards the end of the show if we even get there. But anyway, just following on from the conversation we were sort of having as we close that last hour out. In the headlines this morning, in the news, first up in COVID news, U.S. COVID cases have officially passed 19 million. Yesterday in the U.S., 1,345 more people died from the virus, bringing the total U.S. deaths to 332,246. Spain's health minister said his country plans to collect and share with other European Union nations information about residents who decide to not get vaccinated for COVID-19. The country's health minister said on Monday, that's right, they're setting up a registry. He stressed that vaccination would not be compulsory, but that a register would be set up that would include all the people who turned down the vaccine after being called up for vaccination by Spain's public health service. So they call you up. If you say no to a vaccine, if you say that you're not going to get it, they put you on a list effectively. In an interview with a Spanish television channel, he said that, quote, this is not a public document and it will be done with the highest respect for data privacy, end quote. His comments come a day after Spain launched its vaccination program with the goal of vaccinating 2.5 million people between January and March, all of them within priority health groups, starting out with residents of nursing homes and the healthcare professionals who care for them. That is where you start. But again, the core here, not to bury the lead, the core of this headline, Spain planning on setting up a registry for people who choose not to get the vaccine. And this won't be available to the public, but it will be spread between governments. And possibly, my interjection here, admittedly, possibly used for travel, for determining who gets to travel where. Various airlines have said they will require a vaccine. I'm planning on getting one personally, so this doesn't, affect me personally. It's not like I'm going to be a dissident on this one. But for the general public, the fact that there is a registry getting set up here, be shared between governments of people who choose not to get a vaccine, I don't know. It seems pretty shady to me. In other news, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced new, tougher coronavirus restrictions a day after the country recorded more than 1 million COVID-19 cases. Indoor and outdoor gatherings will be banned, a curfew introduced from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., and alcohol sales will be prohibited. Mr. Ramaphosa said the country was at an extremely dangerous point in the pandemic and action had to be taken. Recently, authorities confirmed that a new, faster-spreading variant of the virus had been detected in South Africa. In national political news and also COVID news, the House of Representatives on Monday passed a measure to increase stimulus checks for Americans under a certain income level to $2,000. This comes after President Donald Trump championed the effort, sending the bill to the Senate where its future is less certain. The legislation, which passed with a 275 to 134 vote, comes a day after Trump signed a coronavirus relief bill into law Sunday evening. That measure provides for $600 in direct payments, but after that deal was brokered and passed out of Congress, Trump railed against the amount as too low and rallied for $2,000 checks instead. This prompted House Democrats to push for an increase. And Senator Bernie Sanders has threatened to delay a crucial vote to override Trump's veto on a defense funding bill unless the Senate holds a vote on these $2,000 checks. As Jamarl and I were talking about earlier, interesting to see the two ends of the spectrum sort of folding in on themselves here like a Mobius strip. And again, the two presidential contenders back in 2016, before Hillary Clinton pushed Bernie Sanders out of the race, with the DNC establishment, with the whole machine there, what could have been the two rivals agreeing on this at this point and publicly agreeing on this in this sort of tacit way. It's just interesting to see happening. Anyway. In other news, U.S. District Judge Allison Nathan, in a brief order Monday, has denied Ghislaine Maxwell's second attempt at pretrial release, concluding that none of the new information altered the court's previous determination that Maxwell, an alleged co-conspirator of deceased sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, posed a flight risk if granted bail. Maxwell's legal team spent months preparing what they billed as a quote-unquote comprehensive bail package containing substantial information, they said, that was not available to present to the court at Maxwell's initial detention hearing in July. Several friends and family whose names were redacted from the public court filings had pledged assets and offered to co-sign the bond. The renewed bail application also confirmed for the first time that Maxwell, 59, has been married since 2016 to Scott Borgerson, the founder of a maritime investments company called Cargometrics and a former fellow in residence at the Council on Foreign Relations. In international news, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has accused Colombia of masterminding an attack against the Venezuelan military with support from the country's president, Ivan Duque. Colombia is, I'm quoting here from Maduro, Colombia is preparing new attacks against the country's military with trained mercenaries with funding from Ivan Duque, preparing attacks at the end of this year, end quote. Again, that is Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro saying that in a speech that he shared on Twitter. Famous Senegalese American singer Akon wants to build a futuristic city in Senegal. The new $6 billion project called Akon City will be situated in the middle of a municipality in Senegal, and Akon plans it to be a refuge for all members of the African diaspora. He calls the future region a quote-unquote real-life Wakanda and plans to create a technology center and Senewood in it to develop the film industry there. There will be a resort, condominiums, and a stadium. It's also planned that the city will operate on renewable energy sources and will mainly use Acoin, its own cryptocurrency. After undergoing 2 years of design and development, Akon announced that construction will begin in 2021. On Monday, a Saudi court sentenced prominent human rights activist Loujain al-Hathloul to 5 years and 8 months in prison on terrorism-related charges and banned her from leaving the country for 5 years. This sparked a torrent of international criticism. Al-Hathloul, 31 years old, was arrested in May 2018 with about a dozen other women's rights activists just weeks before the historic lifting of a decades-long ban on female drivers, a reform they had long campaigned for. Alexei Navalny has been warned that if he does not immediately return home to Russia from Germany and report to a Moscow office as early as Tuesday morning, he will face serious jail time. Russia's Federal Prison Service accused Mr. Navalny on Monday of violating the terms of a suspended prison sentence he is still serving out from a 2014 conviction. The service also claims he is evading supervision of Russia's Criminal Inspection Authority. And our last headline here, Korea's superconducting tokamak advanced research device, that's K-STAR is the acronym, recently set a world record by maintaining its plasma at a super hot 180 million degrees Fahrenheit for 20 seconds. That's over 100 million degrees Celsius. This comes after K-STAR reached the plasma ion temperature of 100 million degrees, that's Celsius again, for the first time in 2018 for only 1.5 seconds. So they beat that by a factor of more than 10. So far, there have been other fusion devices that have briefly managed plasma at temperatures of 100 million degrees or higher. None of them, however, broke the barrier of maintaining the operation for 10 seconds or longer. This is the first time. The final goal of the K-STAR is to succeed in a continuous operation of 300 seconds with an ion temperature higher than 100 million degrees Celsius by 2025. And with that, those are our headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, we have some. I rushed through those headlines, so we have a couple of minutes here. Let's get into this. I'm doing the radio show, so I don't really have time to read too much of this stuff. But as we were going over the break, I was doing a little bit of research here. It seems, and this is from back in September. This is just polling on the CDC, Robert Redfield, and Fauci. It seems like public trust in all of them has fallen since earlier this year. And again, this is polling data is a couple of months old. I do want to downplay my own side here because, who knows? I should do more research.
Because the polling I'm coming out is in December. But go ahead, finish your point.
No, go for it. What did you find?
Well, it did seem that there was a downtick, but this one, December 8th, willingness to get COVID-19 vaccine ticks up 63% in the United States. I can show you, here's another one, Morning Consult. On Fauci, where it says public trust in Fauci is at, right here, 32% of registered voters said Dr. Fauci's handling of COVID is excellent, while 20% said the president of Donald Trump. 79% of Democrats said Fauci has done an excellent job. This is October 14th. This is after the other polling. Look, this is my thing. I don't doubt.
That's not that many. I just want to put, that's not that many. 32% is not that many.
You mean 79% of Democrats? Well, 56% of independents and 54% of Republicans. Well, Republicans had their doubts right off the bat for obvious reasons of Trump.
And Fauci, we weren't talking about Fauci. Fauci's its own thing.
I do want to add something on Fauci to back up your point that I'm very annoyed by Fauci by. One of the other things that just came out a couple of hours ago was that Fauci basically misled the public again. And this time, he didn't want to give the public the real numbers on how bad things were regarding like herd immunity and those type of things because he didn't feel like the public was ready to hear the numbers. But now he feels the public can hear his true thoughts. This is why. Like when I make the argument like, look, Fauci ultimately did good work, etc. And people are like, no, dude, Fauci was doing politics and everything else. It's this nonsense. Well, it's like, dude, you're not there for politics. You're there to basically do the science and tell people what's going on. And it seems that in multiple occasions, Fauci has not done that. So if people have this notion of, can I trust the guy? That's assuming they even know this. But can they trust the guy? Stuff like this that makes it that much harder to believe him. So I'm giving credence to your point.
Are you changing your take on Fauci? Jamarl, are you changing your take on Fauci?
I'm not changing my take on Fauci. I don't think my take has changed. I don't like the politics of this stuff where these guys are mixing the two up. It's not that I deviated on that. I think my thing was always, it just seems like a lot of punches were going Fauci's way that I didn't entirely think he deserved. But if Fauci is screwing with the numbers because he feels a particular way about whether America can hear it or not, then clearly I'm against that. And that goes to the whole thing of why people were taking shots at Fauci in the first place, which at this point I pretty much have to stand back and let those punches hit Fauci. Because, it's like, are you serious? Like, I don't want to tell the American public the truth because I don't think they can deal with it. Get out of here.
That's like the abusive spouse / parent archetype or something like that, where you're like, you can't handle it. I'm gonna keep you in the dark. That's gaslighting effectively. And yeah, that is, between the masks, which of course that was the main thing that people were slamming Fauci on. That was the main thing I was slamming him for. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, we single out Fauci because he's the figurehead of, he is the head of the White House's coronavirus task force. And in that sense, he is the figurehead of America's coronavirus response. But he's just one person. I would say there's a wider institutional complacency and complicity. And I think you can see it. I don't want to get back into a stupid debate here, because a lot of debates are stupid. But I think you can see that there is dropping trust over the course of the year in the CDC. I'm sure that if I looked at the global trust in the World Health Organization, that will have dropped, because what the CDC did and said effectively came from the World Health Organization's recommendations. It was pretty much one-to-one connection between, what the World Health Organization advised national governments to do and what in the United States our CDC actually did. And that's a incredible problem for all the Event 201s, for all the and there were a couple of them, Crimson Contagion, Event 201, for the various sort of events made in anticipation of a pandemic like this. A lot of the focus on messaging seemed, a lot of it had to do with creating a set of messages and widely disseminating those through the media that the public would believe, so that you can effectively manage public opinion. And I don't want to, I will criticize that, because I think you should try to not just manipulate the public, not just educate the public, but make them so they are more capable of educating themselves, give them that sort of independence, because and furthermore, not try to suppress opinions that oppose what the public wants to pursue, because if you do, it gets really complicated. But broadly, it's this sort of black market for information where you're hamstringing yourself in the long run by overly manicuring what the public's allowed to think and say. So you don't want that. But I do get where some of them are going. The problem is, it seems like they're shooting themselves in the foot. It seems like the CDC and the World Health Organization shot themselves in the foot, and Fauci, sure, by actively lying in a couple of cases. So if you want to maintain your credibility, if you want to inform the public, do that. Don't do it through suppressing information. Do it through not lying. That would be the first and foremost. That's your first line of offense and defense in the information space. Jamarl, we've got to go into a break, but what's your take?
I agree with you on this. Credibility. Like, people attack Alex Jones, or people attack... What they don't get is that the only reason that Alex Jones, or quote-unquote conspiracy theories, gain credence is because the failure or the lack of credibility of media and the unaccountability of that stuff. Meaning, if you get the Iraq War wrong, if you get Russiagate wrong, there needs to be some reckoning on that. And if you can't have a reckoning on that, then you can't be mad at people for losing faith and credibility in the institution itself and start looking at other places for truth. I think that's and so, yeah, I agree with you. If you're going to, look, don't lie to the public on this stuff. But by the same token, you also kind of have to recognize that if you don't have the institutions in place that have due diligence to ensure that the public has what it needs in order to deal with the virus, then everything else gets mangled. Like how you talk about it gets mangled because you can't talk about it honestly. How you deal with it gets mangled because you don't have the forces in place to try to deal with it, or the institutions in place. They didn't have instructions to give checks, for God's sake. They had to use the IRS. But let's take a break. I roundly agree with you on this. I generally agree with you. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment. And Fauci, stop lying, dog.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usually flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Frost. We are joined by Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Jumpitarian, and recovering libertarian. I've got to say that's a nice case of alliteration at the end of your relatively new bio there. We used to just bill you as libertarian economist. But that's a denouement if I ever had to read one. Mark, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing okay. My cat finally went over the rainbow, and
oh man.
So, well, I got 20 years, and he had a good life. So, we've talked about it before, but death is what makes love possible. If we lived infinite lives, we would not miss anybody because we would eventually replace them. And it's the knowledge that I can't replace him. I could get 20 more cats, and it wouldn't be him. And so
that's an intellectual way of trying to deal with something that's painful.
On the other side of the coin, I feel good about it. So,
Mark, that's an intellectual way of trying to deal with something that's painful, and so I appreciate it. Look, we just had a dog today, Bo. Bo was a rescue. He was a pit bull, and he had cancer in the year. We had the surgery and all that good stuff. He was doing fine, and then he gets sick again, and this time they are saying stuff like stomach, like leakage, talking all of this damage and everything else. And it's like, you're like, wait a minute, that dog suffered for like a month. Yeah. Oh, that is painful. Because it's like, it's not like they can articulate it. They can't explain it. They just sit there and suffer. You can't even give them pain meds because they can't necessarily get across to you that they are basically suffering. So it's like, part of me feels like, yeah, he had a good life for most of the life. But I got to be honest, that last month, the last 2 months, oh, that hurts. So I feel you on this notion of, it makes love possible and everything else. But those are words that are trying to paper over hurt and pain, basically. Yeah, that's dark.
Sad.
I'm sorry. That's very dark. I apologize.
Talking about gout. Just to give the feline we're speaking of the name he deserves. You're talking about Gauss, your cat Gauss, right, Mark?
Yes.
All right. I'm sorry to hear that. Thank you for telling us, though. Other than that, how were your holidays? Before we get into the real meat of the matter here.
Really, really good. It was a good time. I had friends around, and I was able to enjoy myself. And so it was. Other than that, I had that blanket of sadness around me, but yeah, I had a good week, and I especially liked your last segment. I thought that both of you hit the nail on the head, and it bleeds into what I'm into, the economics of all this. I think we have a crisis of institutions in our country because, as you said, the reason conspiracy theories take hold is because people, to some degree, believe they're plausible. Because we get lied to, or we get mistreated so often under rationalities that are bankrupt, and then we scratch our head and say, how did this happen? As if there's no explanation for it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And you put it, I think you put it very well. Jamarl, I'll hand it over to you, but I think that, Mark, you put it very well. Exactly that. The reason that conspiracy theories are getting more popular is that we are losing trust in the informational institutions that, guided the public's beliefs for the longest time. And in some ways still do. But that's, if you want to look for the source of fake news or whatever you want to call it, even though some fake news is true, it's in the collapse of the credibility of these institutions. Anyway, Jamarl.
Yeah, it's absolutely. Mark, what did you think of the stimulus? I'm curious. I was very curious about your point of view on this because you've made the point that money needs to be dropped from helicopters. And you also made this perfect point about Crackhead Bob, that Crackhead Bob has people that he's paying that to who's going to go out and get groceries and bread and going to make sandwiches and all that stuff. Like Crackhead Bob do what Crackhead Bob does. It's for the economy. And I told my wife, you're going to buy that Xbox for America because we need to get the economy back up and running. So what did you think of the stimulus? I got to be honest. I thought it was a slap in the face personally. And that they weren't giving to 2000 was problematic. How did you see it?
I see it exactly like you do, except I'm much more extreme with it. My view is that, first of all, there's not very much stimulus in it. This is a demand-driven problem that we have. Supply-side economics, you have to close that chapter of economics for this particular problem because it's not a trickle-down. The problem isn't that we have insufficient capital, and if we could just get entrepreneurs out there to invest it, everything will be fine again. What we have right now is a demand-driven problem, meaning that there's about a third of the population that has been significantly financially hammered. So my outrage in all of this isn't $600 versus $2,000. It's that's the choices we're debating. I think it should be a minimum of $24,000 for the people who really need it. I don't need it. That there are people that haven't had a real paycheck in almost a year. They're struggling. They're scamming. They got every side hustle in the world going on. And so I started doing some numbers last week. I just went in and I tried to determine how many people are truly suffering, meaning they've missed paychecks. Some people haven't missed paychecks at all. And so I looked at what they were spending in terms of actual explicit and guarantees, roughly $3 trillion. My estimate is there's about 50 million people in the country who are truly suffering. Well, divide 3 trillion by 50 million, that's $60,000. So in a perfect world, you'd give everybody $60,000. Well, just cut that in third. Let's just say, okay, I'm a realist. I know Congress wants their pork. Should there be pork? No, it should be all rationally driven. But let's deal with the world as it is and let Congress have some pork. Well, we could give that 50 million people $24,000 and still have $2 trillion for Congress to go have their pork fest. So I am offended by both parties, all three parties that I tend to follow, because they act like this is some kind of act of welfare or some kind of benevolent thing we're going to do for the little people. It's not. This is compensation. Government forcibly took the livelihood of people and they gave them crumbs. And for the life of me, I don't understand how anyone who is in a position of governance could say, we're going to take your job away from you and we're going to give you $600 or even $2,000. It's a slap in the face to the people who actually make the country turn around. It isn't people like me. It's the people that show up and they do the jobs that aren't well protected. And that's why they get picked on. And we're turning into a country that's bimodal. There's people that are really successful and doing well. They're making, multiple six figures. And then there's people that are scraping. They're worried about getting evicted. They're worried their electricity is going to be turned off. And we've snubbed our nose at these people. And this is the attitude that over time, let's go back to that theme of the last segment, it reduces our faith in our institutions, and that's when tyranny comes. People become so fed up, they'll vote for a strong man. They'll start saying, well, maybe democracy isn't really the way. Maybe we need a tyrant to come in and fix all this. Very similar to the classic movie Gabriel over the White House, where the president dismisses Congress and starts monarchy, basically, in the United States. It's a classic movie. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It actually brings out some interesting ideas, and I believe FDR had some sort of input into the script.
That's very interesting. I'm just going to, briefly highlight this. I think it sounds like you're saying, and this is admittedly super trite, when it comes to Congress, let them eat pork. Let them get away with their extra spending if they want to. I can't help but agree with you. $24,000 sounds about right. That sounds pretty radical, especially coming from a quote unquote recovering libertarian. But I agree with you. And like you're saying, I don't really need it either. Even though here's the thing, though, I would technically qualify for the $2,000. You know, I 100% would qualify based on the amount of money I made and have made. But I don't need it. If I got that money, I wouldn't spend it. It's, you know, we're already on the other side of Christmas. I just put that in a bank account and hope I can retire slightly earlier or something like that, or make a donation or something. We're doing some means testing. How can you target it from an economic, from the perspective of a professor in economics? How can you target it other than simple income levels? How do you do that on a broad basis, like you're talking about, giving it to people who actually need it, while, skipping over those who don't? Mark.
Income testing is probably the best quick way to do it. One of the problems we get, especially in the age of mass media, is, for instance, it's like the dead people that got checks, back when they did it last time. That's inevitable. It's the same concept as Crackhead Bob, right? Some people are so freaked out that any stimulus or relief is going to go to Crackhead Bob that they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, okay, I'm willing to accept the small statistical anomalies like Crackhead Bob and checks to dead people, because that's what happens when you do something in mass. I do want to argue with you a little bit. I don't think it is radical for a libertarian. The fundamental principle of libertarians is property rights. Most of us argue, first and foremost, we own ourselves. We own our right to go truck, barter, and exchange and make a living. If government comes in with its relative infinite police power relative to the individual and says, we're taking your job away, but we're not going to do anything with the debts you owe and the bills you pay,
then they owe you something.
Theft. Yes,
I hear what you're saying.
Theft.
Yes.
I'm not suggesting a stimulus. I'm not suggesting even relief. I'm suggesting compensation. And then you're going to get
repayment for that. Mark, we need to go into a break.
Sure.
And there are some of those people, but I hear what you're saying. That's marginal compared to the bulk of folks that we're talking about here. It's interesting. I just think it would strike a lot of folks with some, they would be surprised and slightly incredulous to hear that coming out of the mouth of a libertarian. But that's what you're saying is very true. That would be compensation for something that was taken from you, in that basic sense. In any event, we need to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and the voice of Mark Frost, with whom we'll be returning in just a minute. Be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and you are listening to Mark Frost. He's our guest for this segment, continuing our conversation from the last. He is an economist, a professor, a consultant, a drummer, an Eagle Scout, a Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. And we're talking about sort of radical changes potentially in the nature of America's governance. Last segment, we were talking about $24,000 as a repayment to people whose jobs have been lost by the fiat of the government. On this side of the break, I actually want to turn to a tweet of yours you put out yesterday, Mark. I'm going to quote here from that tweet. We need a new constitutional amendments. No government shall coercively shut down its economy or its individual sectors without direct compensation to the people displaced from their work. 2, Congress shall appropriate no funds for foreign aid if the budget is in deficit. I think a lot of people would, at the very least, agree with the second one and arguably with the first two. We've gotten to a weird place in our economy. Can you just back those up? Why do you think those are necessary? Why do you think those would be useful? And do you think people would go in for them, Mark?
Well, first of all, the answer to the first one is ideological. And I don't care what anybody says, you have to begin from first principles. So there is no such thing as a completely objective analysis because our analytical work comes from our vision of things first. So the first one is ideological. I argue that it's a right to truck, barter, and exchange. I have the right to sell my time to another person. I have the right. And the government should not have the right for any reason to usurp that. Now, that I understand is very controversial because other people with different ideologies believe in sort of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, et cetera, things like that. But that's my values because I'm very offended by shutdowns, especially if we're going to have a capitalist system and have shutdowns. You have to compensate people for the theft that you've taken from them. And it isn't just people that have jobs that I'm worried about. I'm very worried about being a professor and working with, young adults so much. I'm very worried about the people that were in college or were about to go to college, and the world that's been handed to them is very small. So it's not just the people that had jobs and lost them. It's the people who were going to get a job but can't now. And their life was put on hold, and they still have to fend for themselves. A young family making, say, $30,000 a year with 1 or 2 kids, $30,000 is poverty level. To take that $30,000 away and say, we're going to give you $2,000 is a slap in the face. It goes against, at least by my values, it goes against every rule of decency that should exist in a good society. And this is an interesting thing that I see going on because progressives, libertarians, and there's a lot of overlap I see. I wouldn't be shocked if there's going to be some new parties. I mean, real, definitive, viable new parties coming out because people, I certainly have, I don't believe anything Republicans or Democrats say anymore. The last politician I really liked in terms of trusted was Tulsi. And look what they did to her.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Like, I don't pay attention to the parties at this point. I don't even listen to Biden speeches because I don't believe anything that comes out of these guys' mouth. And so I feel you on that. And look, I've always said, libertarians, I agree with like 50% of what they say. These two tweets, I can agree with both. The first one is going to be a fudge in regards to, this notion of compensation. Because I am perfectly okay with standing on the corpse of health insurance companies. And if compensation is ensuring that there is some kind of pathway to these guys getting another job, fair enough. But I'm okay with them going. So it depends on what it means, even though I can agree with both. I kind of want to fight on this notion of rights, but I kind of don't because I agree with what you're saying here. Meaning to me, as a flat fact, rights aren't God-given because God has never stepped into a court of law. At the end of the day, you are just a person. And that what you can defend is what you can defend. The society hopefully comes together and recognize human beings and the rights of human beings and those type of things. But from the standpoint of those things being defended and everything else, it seems not so much unless your society puts those things into law. But I don't want to fight on that. I want to say I agree with you on both of these because I think you're right. And I think it's worse than what you're explaining. 42% of the people before COVID hit were making $18,000 a year. Now, you were making the point that $30,000 was a poverty wage. $18,000, like $30,000 is a poverty wage when people are trying to live in normal terms. But in real terms, $18,000 is far, far worse. And many of these people were paying for their families and everything else. Those jobs went up in smoke. Or those were the people that were forced to be on the front lines while the COVID thing was taking place, because they're stuck with the question of, okay, do I put my life on the line for the COVID thing, or do I, stay at home for my kid? So I agree with you on this, which is kind of why I don't want to pick a fight on this. How, beyond the sending the money and everything else, it just seems like, our world or our Congress or our politics have gotten to a point where they don't care, and clearly don't care. Like, not, I think they don't care about us. No, it seems like they overtly don't care about us. How did this happen? What do you think was the impetus of it getting to the point where the politics became so detached from the American population itself?
I think it was, well, again, this is ideological. I think that's a good question. I feel like I need to give an answer because you asked me a question, but I don't think I know the answer. It involves things outside of my competence that would have to explain it. But clearly, part of it is the anarcho-capitalist wing of libertarians and the Republican Party, and for that matter, the opposite end in the Democratic Party. Raising taxes is not socialism. Socialism is the collective ownership of the major factors of production. So to raise taxes so you can have, say, universal health care is not socialism. Sweden is not a socialist country, neither is Norway. They are capitalist countries, but they recognize they have values in a democratic society and they have to be paid for. So I have no problem with billionaires existing. No problem at all. In fact, I would like to be one. But you have to fund the values that you have in government somehow. And there's not that many ways to do it. You can print money, you can borrow money, or you can raise revenues, also known as taxes. It bothers me how we funded this COVID thing. In typical Congress style, the automatic default knee-jerk reaction is supply-side economics. The problem is we need to pump capital into businesses. Well, no, that wasn't the problem. The problem was there was a liquidity problem with about a third of Americans, to the point where they live basically paycheck to paycheck, and they simply could not withstand months and months of no income. You can't have a functioning capitalist economy that's bimodal, meaning you only have relatively very rich people and relatively very poor people. If you want to see what kind of society you get when you have that, go to places like Indonesia and look and see how people live and how distrustful everybody is of everybody and how institutions have completely failed. So one of the most critical principles, one of the most important principles of economics is the law of the diminishing marginal utility of money. Give $1 to someone that makes that $17,000 a year that you were talking about. That helps them significantly. Take $1 away from me and I don't even notice it. Now, this is where I lose half of the Libertarian Party, because they're anarcho-capitalists. They believe the best society would be no government at all. People are governments unto themselves. And in a sort of game theoretic fabric, people will work out their own problems within a complete, total environment of liberty. I dismiss that. I think human beings need governance. We have to be organized, and I don't see any substitute for government. I don't think government is a necessary evil. I think it's a necessary good. Good government produces good economics. Bad government produces bad economics. So you can call it the redistribution of wealth, or you can call it building a national psyche that lets people know that they're cared about, at least on a minimal basis. And it's distressing to me on both sides of the aisle to see how poor people are viewed. The Democrats, I don't know if you caught that Pelosi Wolf Blitzer clip. That offended me to death. Nancy Pelosi actually saying, we feed them.
Yes, I saw that clip.
Nose up in the air sort of thing. I mean, I was like, oh my God, no wonder nobody has any faith in this. Look at how you view these people while you're eating your stupid ice cream. It's, my favorite economist, Joseph Schumpeter, wrote about this in 1943 in a classic book. It's what made me want to become an economist, called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And he argued that capitalism works out of faith. As long as people generally have faith in it, it works really, really well. But when the institutions it depends on, those middle class institutions start to degrade, when the distribution of wealth starts, when the middle class just gets shrunk and you have a bimodal distribution, you have serfs and you have barons. What that leads to is a warped form of capitalism, which is really a sort of feudalism or even a form of fascism. Fascism isn't necessarily
it doesn't happen by magic. It doesn't happen by magic.
Fascism is a blend of government and business, so that government chooses and directs where that goes. And I do not see how the country can continue without understanding that we live in a different world that existed 40 years ago, and people have to have a minimal understanding. They have to believe that the government, 1, knows what they're going through, 2, cares about them, and 3, is competent to provide an environment by which they can help themselves. I think that's low-level, basic premises that any government needs to have to be effective.
Mark, we have to cut it short, but this goes back to the FDR line, saving capitalism. Basically throwing money into the public to give the public faith and confidence that the government can basically attend to the needs. No, man, look, I agree with all that. I totally agree with you. The voice you are listening to is Mark Frost, an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. You can follow Mark on Twitter at FrostyCash. And Mark, I have to be honest, man, I really do. Look, I know when people say, I appreciate the way you articulate what is idealism or what is ideology versus what is reality. I love that because most people don't know the difference. And so it's like you have people come on and it's like you're arguing. It's like, dude, you're just arguing ideology. You make the distinction between those two things, which is often why, despite, I mean, sometimes disagree with some of this stuff, I enjoy the conversation because you have an honest approach in looking at it and thinking about it. And I appreciate that. So this is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
How y'all doing? Good morning. I have a couple of comments before I say my comments. Pardon Julian Assange, pardon all whistleblowers. Look into my case on Google whistleblower Terry Simon. They had a study came out of China that the national Nature.com, Nature Communications out of Britain, published November the 20th. I saw it yesterday. It's kind of hard for me to try to break it down, but y'all have to read it. Maybe Kim Iverson, she can read it, but I attach it to y'all link for today underneath your tweet. It's basically talking about extrematic areas, and they did a study of like 9 million people, and of the 9 million people, 34,000 had COVID-19. Then they became well, right? And of that 34,000, months later, only 107 tested positive, still tested positive for COVID-19, which was a small amount. So they did COVID-19 tracing, contact tracing, and of 300 people that were asymptomatic carriers, and they came around 1,200 people. And these 300 people was around 1,200 people. So one person per four people. So one person that had it was in contact with 4 people. And they found out through the test that these 4 people did not catch it from them. Okay? So what in that report was saying was like very little chance of spreading it from asymptomatic carriers, but at the same time in the report they say still wear your mask and still social distance. Y'all need to just check it out. Okay. My second comment, when I spoke about that woman yesterday, Nurse Khalila Misha out of Tennessee, when I shared that audio for speaking, Twitter suspended my account for 12 hours. All right. I didn't know. I was thinking maybe it was for that. When I went back online, it was for that tweet. And I had to like delete it so I can get my account back. So, but hopefully one day maybe that lady can start a GoFundMe payment plan or whatever, GoFundMe thing, and get a lawyer. She needs representation because she's been, basically getting kicked out of Twitter and stuff. She had 6 accounts that took away from her, what I understand. So her name is Nurse Khalila Mitchell. Y'all can go to BitChute to look at her, That's all I wanted to say today.
Tarif, thank you for calling in. That last one is ridiculous. I had watched that video you were talking about. And I mean, the story here for those who are new to it, she's a nurse. She got the COVID vaccine shortly after she got Bell's palsy, where half of your face is paralyzed. For some people, it's temporary. You can recover from it. For some people, it's permanent. And for those who recover from it, sometimes they don't recover fully. So it is a serious condition. I'm a big, I don't even need to throw my perspective in here. Broadly, that's the story there. I watched the video when Tarif sent it over a few days ago, and there wasn't anything too ridiculous. At one point, she says, there wasn't anything ridiculous at all. At one point, she says, she recommends that people not get the vaccine because this is what it did to her. I'm guessing that's why they're censoring it. I'm guessing that's why they're taking it down. But she just what it is. She's a nurse who got this and is now recommending that people not take it. I want to comment on his nature study too. But Jamarl, did you watch that video? Do you have any idea what we're talking about? If so, what do you think?
I haven't seen the video. There we are. I haven't seen the video, so I can't necessarily comment on the video.
Okay. All right, for sure. All right.
I mean, look. Basically, the problem is clear, right? If the person is saying don't take the vaccine because I got Bell palsy, Twitter, of course, is going to slam that. Like that's. I'm not. Without me giving an evaluation of whether that's good, bad, right, wrong, or not, that's probably where that's coming from. You have this big push for people to get the vaccine. All of these people are trying. Because, look, I agree with you. I think on some level people might be concerned about the vaccine, but may be okay with it because of the number of people that are dying. And the public, or the congressmen and stuff like that, they seem to be doing this big push to get people vaccinated. And so Twitter is probably following fashion and Facebook just like they typically do on this stuff. And when they find something that they think pushes back against what the public is basically pushing for, what let's say the political space and the media space is pushing for, they slam it. That's what I think took place. I don't think you should do that personally. I think that's bad. I think it draws a circle around that stuff. I don't like the censorship, but that's probably where it came from. But I haven't seen the video in and of itself.
Yeah, no, it's nothing intense. It's a 2-minute video from what I've seen, at least. There's probably a longer clip, but the clip that I saw that was getting more widely shared that Tarif sent to me is just a short clip, and she's crying and she's talking about it, and it's rough to watch. But yeah, it's like you're saying. I agree with you. That's exactly what it is. We've got 2 other callers. Real briefly, for the people who are interested in reading the study that Tarif was talking about, it's post-lockdown SARS-CoV-2 nucleic acid screening in nearly 10 million residents. of Wuhan, China. That is the title of the article. And just looking briefly through the abstract, haven't gone in depth into it because, like he said, he just sent it over to us. It seems to be exactly what he's saying, that among asymptomatic patients, there were no identified cases of spread, which, if that's true, if that holds true more widely, is extremely significant in terms of understanding transmission and public policy, all this stuff, when it comes to managing the pandemic going forward. Anyway, we've got two other callers. We are still taking calls, 202-521-1320. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Good morning, guys. Real quick, just a real quick look into the Akon thing. It's a complete scam. It's a complete scam. As a 3D artist myself, the layout they have of the city, which I know is just more of a concept art, but it's garbage. It's like first year student 3D design work level is garbage. The investors all have, if you look up the investment, it's actually only two real investment companies. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but if you look up the investors, the so-called investors, one of the corporations has one of the organizations has a horrible rating on the Better Business Bureau, and the other one is more about helping him kick off his cryptocurrency. So it's a lot of just real stuff there. It's a lot there. But that aside, what I wanted to get to was the point that Jamarl asked Mr. Frost during the call about at what point did we see the policy divide itself from the people as presented by our government. I would say it's been a long time. It's been a long time coming, and we could go back and look at some of the earlier things, that brought about the whole point, the whole comment of people's corporations are people too, because if we believe that the actual middle class is the backbone of the economy, then of course you would think you would take care of that. So being that they do not, one would have to assume that they no longer view the middle class or the working man as the sustainable nectar of the government of the country.
Bree, I think it's worse than that. I think they get it that the middle class is the lifeblood of the country, because the moment that the COVID thing went belly up, what happened? The economy hit the skids. Now, I think in their heads, the public has nowhere else to go, whether it's Democrat or Republican. I think in their heads, the public is beaten down, and over the course of, let's say, like 40, 50 years, they've accepted the politics. Bill Clinton getting rid of Glass-Steagall. Bill Clinton, elimination of welfare. Bill Clinton, elimination the telecommunications thing. Explosion of the prison population. And they continue to vote Democrat. Like, even after that, you have Obama, 95% of the income to the top 1%. They still continue to vote Democrat.
Real quick, Jamal.
Go for it.
If you don't mind, not that I disagree with you, because I wholly agree with you on it. I guess I should have worded it differently. It's not that I just don't feel that they're dependent. They see themselves as dependent on the middle class. Is a better way of putting it. They, like as you just stated, they know they have us. They know that we just drone on in and sheepishly go about our way of doing whatever the bidding is and being good human resources, and providing and producing. They know that already. They know that the black people are going to vote Democrat no matter what. They know that they can pass corrupt laws and be corrupt, and we're not going to do anything. So I guess how I should have phrased it is that they see no threat from the middle class. They see no threat from the everyday American, right? And as far as benefits go, as far as financial gain go, I think they see there is more in their view to be gained on the global stage and the corporate stage. This is why all their energy, all of their protection goes to it. You guys made the point earlier, and I wrap it up. You guys made the point earlier you made the point earlier that that's their base. Democratic, but I would just expand and say Democratic and Republicans know that their base is their corporate donors, the big money that's out there in the global industry and the industrial world. It's not so much the middle class or the working class in just this country alone, which is why they don't care. They don't care. So I do agree with you. I would just say that their focus is moved outwards because they know they got us. And that's basically it.
Brave. Thank you for the call. We've got two other calls. I want to try to get to them. Ben from Ohio, you're on the air. Got about a minute here. What's on your mind, Ben?
Hey, how are you? just one side note regarding off of the corporations are people kind of thing. If you really look into that, that kind of like undermines the whole 13th Amendment and whatnot with the whole slavery. Like you can't own a person, but you can own a company. I don't know. I just don't like it. In regards to the whole like force to vote thing, so there's actually some historical precedent regarding that. If you look back, I think in the 1920s, like 1922, 1923, with the original progressive party, the progressive movement that was taking place, they actually did something very similar, and it worked. I think one of the main focal points around that was a guy by the name of Gillette, not the razor, but yeah, like they basically just voted present if they didn't meet some progressive demands, and it caused such a stir up that they were forced to capitulate to.
We've got, I think it was like 7 times or something like this. I think Jimmy Dore himself was talking about this in one of his videos on the subject. But yeah, I know it did work. You're right. Ben from Ohio, thank you for the call. We got Anthony calling in from Detroit. Anthony, you're on the line. What's on your mind, man?
Hey, what's up? What's up? Motor City checking in. Good morning. I'll try to be brief. Two quick comments. One about the coronavirus and the vaccines. I myself, I have a biology degree, but so I thoroughly respect the science of vaccines. But given the Tuskegee experiments in further history and even recent history, forced sterilizations in California and state prisons, I'm just very curious, like how many other Black people just won't be getting the vaccine out of that, just like hesitancy, just however you want to describe it, and when if ever we'll overcome that. And then to the other guest, the guest that you guys had on that mentioned that about billionaires, that they were comfortable with billionaires existing, and I think it's the delusion in the second part of their statement that they have any chance of becoming a billionaire that makes them.
Anthony, I'm sorry, man. I've got to cut you here. We need to close out. We don't have enough time. Thank you for the call. With that first one, we're going to have to come back to it. With that second point, hope you call in some other day to finish that. Thank you guys for listening. We're closing today's show out. We will be off the air this Friday. It's New Year's Day, but we will be back tomorrow, folks. Thank you again for listening in. Have a great day. See you again tomorrow.
Fault lines. Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Guys, as always, I want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm going to come back on because I want to have more of a conversation about the $2,000 that passed, because I think that's a big deal. Look, it's not that the Democratic Party doesn't have the ability to push for things. It's not that things that are popular from the standpoint of the masses create a certain leverage and the fact that you have to vote for something in and of itself makes it difficult, because at some point somebody's going to run against you and they're going to point out that you voted against this particular issue. It is difficult to tell your constituency, no, I did not believe you as an American were worth $2,000. And so you had Republicans voting for this bill in the House of Representatives. You get into the Senate, they may vote this bill down, but the ruling or the logic of it is the same. It is not easy to vote down a bill that says direct stimulus to the American public that needs that stimulus. You had a part of this country that fell off of a cliff, and Congress didn't give a shit about it. So now, Congress members are put in a position where they have to say yay or nay to something that the public absolutely knows that this is going to them directly. And so it becomes much more harder to do. I am making the point that the same thing is true for Medicare for All or dealing with the healthcare bills from COVID. You could put that up, you can have that fight, and you can make it where you need to deal with this particular issue, and it is difficult to say no to that issue. But my point is the very point, or the very reason that Democrats don't do that is because they don't want to be put on the record for that stuff. Listen to some of the guests that come on this show that have been in the innards of the Democratic Party. They will tell you in a heartbeat that progressive policy gets shut down, that those ideas and those things get shut down. They never get a potential to air because the last thing they want to do is have a fight and vote on those items. Force the vote should come natural. You shouldn't have to have this fight to get people to fight for something like Medicare for All. And the fact that progressives are basically attacked, shit on, marginalized, in and of itself should be more of a reason to do it, not less. The $2,000 stimulus makes that argument and the logic of that argument clearer probably than anything else that you could say, because it makes it that clear how putting something like that up for a vote and how the public watching, knowing that this congressman or that congressman chose to not give them $2,000. And I guarantee you, when it's up for a race, the person who they're running against will be using that against them as a club to bang them over the heads that they weren't willing to do that for the American public. Mark my words. The logic of force the vote is shown in the $2,000 stimulus package. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. Also, make sure you hit the subscription button, guys. We're almost at 30,000. I can't believe that number. But yeah, we're almost at 30,000. We may hit 30,000 by the end of the year. So if you're not subscribed, definitely subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe. I'll talk to you guys